Hello and thank you for joining for today's dark and scary cryptid horror stories. The first story today is called The Purple Mark. This is a cryptid horror story about the Ugandan giant spider, commonly known as the J'ba Fofi. In this story, a disgraced biologist obsessed with impossible zoology, and a pragmatic logistics expert hired to guide him through the dense foliage of the Congolese basin. A series of fragmented journals from the 1890s, Arthur Smith's lost notes, describing a specific sacred grove, where the J'ba Fofi are not just animals, but apex predators that have terraformed their environment. The second story today is called The Gashadokuro of the Forgotten Valley. This is a cryptid horror story about the Balaur massive, multi-headed mythical dragon, or serpent in Romanian folklore. In this story, a group of urban explorers and a historian travel to a remote, landslide-prone valley in rural Japan. They are searching for the ruins of a village wiped out during a forgotten 16th-century skirmish. The historian explains that the village was never formally mourned. The dead were left where they fell, and the land was declared taboo and erased from maps. In the description below, the stories have been time-stamped. Now for today's cryptid horror stories, I hope you all enjoy. The Purple Mark. The audio fragment was recovered from a digital recorder found in the leaf litter of the Congolese basin, 17 miles northeast of the closest village, with a name that appeared on any map. The device was waterlogged, its casing cracked by the pressure of decomposition and the relentless humidity of the jungle, but the memory chip had survived, protected by a layer of waterproofing that its owner had applied with the obsessive care of a man who knew that his work might outlast his life. When the technicians in Kinshasa managed to extract the data, what they heard was not a complete recording but a shard, a fragment torn from the middle of a narrative that had already begun before the device was activated and would continue long after it fell silent. Not the venom, it's the way they weave the silence. The voice belonged to a man, though it was pitched higher than normal, stretched thin by exhaustion and terror into a register that was almost feminine. He was breathing heavily, each inhalation accompanied by the rustle of vegetation and the distant cries of birds that seemed to be coming from somewhere impossibly far away. There was a pause, then the sound of something heavy dragging through wet leaves, a rhythmic scraping that suggested weight and purpose, and something that did not want to be heard. The man whispered something else, too faint to be transcribed, and then the recording captured a sudden, wet snap, the unmistakable sound of bone breaking under pressure, of a joint being forced beyond its tolerance, followed by a gasp that might have been the recorder's owner or might have been someone else who had been standing nearby. Then silence. Not the silence of a recording ending, but the silence of a recording continuing to capture nothing, the microphone still active, still sensitive, still listening to a world that had become too quiet. For 4 minutes and 32 seconds, the device recorded the absence of sound, and in that absence, the technicians swore they could hear something else, something rhythmic, something that breathed. The recorder belonged to Dr. Elias Vance, a biologist whose academic career had collapsed 3 years earlier under the weight of a scandal that the scientific community had dubbed the Madagascar hoax. Vance had published a paper claiming to have discovered a new species of lemur, a nocturnal primate with bioluminescent markings that he had allegedly documented through photographs and genetic samples. The photographs were beautiful, the samples were compelling, and the peer review process had been enthusiastic, until a graduate student from Berlin noticed that the bioluminescence in the images matched the light patterns of a common flashlight filtered through colored gel. The genetic samples, when independently tested, turned out to be from a domestic cat mixed with synthetic markers. Vance had been stripped of his tenure, his publications retracted, and his reputation reduced to a cautionary tale told to graduate students about the dangers of ambition outpacing integrity. But Elias Vance was not a fraud, not in the way his detractors believed. He was a man obsessed with the edges of zoological knowledge, with the creatures that existed in the gaps between verified species and campfire stories. The Madagascar lemur had been a mistake born of desperation, a fabrication designed to secure funding for an expedition that had failed to find the real thing. But the J'ba Fofi was different. The J'ba Fofi was not a fabrication. It was a legend that had persisted in the oral traditions of the Congo for centuries, a creature described by local tribes as a spider of impossible size, a predator that hunted in the deep forest and left behind webs that could snare a man. The colonial administrators had dismissed it as superstition. The biologists had ignored it as folklore. But Vance had found something that made him believe. In the archives of the Royal Geographical Society, buried in a collection of papers that had not been catalogued since the Victorian era, Vance had discovered the fragmented journals of Arthur Smith, a British naturalist who had traveled through the Congo basin in 1893 and had never returned. Smith's final notes, scribbled in a hand that grew progressively more erratic as the pages progressed, described a sacred grove somewhere in the unmapped interior, a place where the trees grew in patterns that suggested cultivation rather than natural distribution, where the underbrush was unnaturally sparse, and where the local guides refused to travel after dark. Smith had written of webs that spanned clearings like bridges, of silk that was stronger than steel cable and pale as birch bark, and of a creature that he had glimpsed only once. A monstrous arachnid, 6 feet in span, black as obsidian, with markings of purple upon its abdomen that glowed in the moonlight like a wound that would not heal. The scientific establishment had dismissed Smith's account as the ravings of a man driven mad by malaria and isolation. But Vance had spent 3 years studying the fragments, cross-referencing the geographical descriptions with satellite imagery, correlating the botanical references with modern surveys of the Congolese interior. And he had found something, a grove deep in the basin where the canopy was unusually uniform, where the soil composition suggested decades of nutrient depletion in a specific pattern, and where the thermal imaging showed a curious absence of mammalian life in a radius of several kilometers. A dead zone, a place that the animals avoided. To reach it, he needed a guide. Not a scientist, not a fellow believer, but someone who could handle the logistics of travel through one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Someone who knew the rivers, the villages, the officials who needed to be bribed and the officials who needed to be avoided. Someone pragmatic enough to keep him alive and skeptical enough to keep him honest. He found Sarah Okonkwo in a bar in Kinshasa, drinking warm beer and arguing with a customs agent about the tariffs on imported outboard motors. She was in her early 30s, with skin the color of dark honey and a build that suggested she could carry her own weight and yours if necessary. She had spent the last decade guiding expeditions through the Congolese basin, everything from mineral surveys to documentary film crews to pharmaceutical research teams, searching for miracle cures in the rainforest. She had seen malaria, dengue, river blindness, and the kind of bureaucratic corruption that could strand a team in the jungle for weeks. She had never seen a giant spider, and she didn't believe they existed. But she believed in getting paid, and Vance was offering enough money to clear her debts and fund her own project, a small ecolodge on the banks of the Lualaba that she had been planning for years. "You're chasing ghosts," she said, when Vance showed her the journal fragments over a table littered with the remains of grilled tilapia and plantain. "There are no spiders that big. The oxygen levels don't support it. The exoskeleton would collapse under its own weight." "Not if the exoskeleton isn't made of chitin," Vance said, leaning forward with the intensity of a man who had been waiting years for someone to listen. Smith described the silk as reinforced, not like normal spider silk. "What if the creature has evolved a composite structure, chitin layered with calcified deposits, like the shells of some crustaceans? What if the size limitation isn't biological but environmental? What if these things only grow to those sizes in specific microclimates, where the resources are unlimited and the competition is absent. What if you're trying to rebuild your reputation with one lucky discovery? Sarah countered, but there was no malice in it. She had guided enough academics to recognize the desperation in Vance's eyes, the hunger for redemption that made men take risks that wiser men would avoid. "I'm not signing on to be part of another hoax, Dr. Vance." "It's not a hoax," Vance said, and the earnestness in his voice was almost painful. "I made a mistake in Madagascar. I let ambition cloud my judgment and I paid for it. But this is real. Smith's journals are real. The dead zone is real. And if there's even a chance that I'm right, that there is a species out there that science has never documented, that would be worth something, wouldn't it? Worth the risk." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, weighing the desperation against the possibility. She had seen the journals, held them in her hands, felt the age of the paper and the authenticity of the ink. She had seen the satellite imagery, the anomalous grove that showed up on thermal scans as a perfect circle of cold in the middle of the warm jungle. And she had seen enough of the world to know that there were places where the natural order had not been fully catalogued, where things still waited in the shadows for the light of human attention. "Double the advance," she said, "and we turn back if I say we turn back, not if you say me." "Done," Vance said, and they shook on it. The journey into the Congolese basin began 3 weeks later, in the dry season when the rivers were navigable and the leeches were fewer, though never absent. They traveled by river for the first leg, a converted fishing boat with an outboard motor that coughed and sputtered and required Sarah's constant attention to keep running. The boat was loaded with supplies: tents, dehydrated food, water purification tablets, satellite phones that would be useless once they passed beyond the range of the nearest cell tower, and the specialized equipment that Vance insisted was essential: high-speed cameras, DNA sampling kits, portable spectrographs, and a device that he called an acoustic interferometer, designed to detect the vibrations of large web structures. They were accompanied by 4 porters, local men from a village near the river's mouth who had worked with Sarah before and knew the terrain. There was Jean-Pierre, a tall man with a scar across his cheek from a childhood encounter with a leopard; his younger brother Moise, who never spoke and carried twice his weight in supplies; Olivier, a jovial man in his 50s who told jokes in Lingala that made even Sarah laugh despite her fluency; and Thomas, the youngest at 19, who had insisted on coming because he wanted to see the demon spider that his grandfather had warned him about as a child. "There is no demon spider," Sarah told him on the first day as they pushed through the secondary growth along the riverbank. "Only big spiders, maybe very big, but not demons." Thomas nodded solemnly, but Sarah caught him making the sign against evil whenever they passed a silk-cocooned insect hanging from a branch, and she knew that the old stories had taken root too deep to be pulled out by rational explanation. The jungle closed around them with the inevitability of water filling a cup. Within 2 days of leaving the river, they were in primary forest, the kind of ancient woodland that had never been logged, never been burned, never been shaped by human hands, except for the narrow trails that local hunters used and abandoned according to seasons and migrations. The trees rose in pillars that vanished into a canopy so dense the sky was reduced to scattered coins of light, and the undergrowth was a tangle of ferns and vines and thorn bushes that required constant cutting to pass through. The air was thick with moisture, a greenhouse atmosphere that made breathing feel like drinking, and the sounds of the forest surrounded them in a constant symphony: birds calling, insects buzzing, monkeys screaming, frogs singing in chorus that rose and fell with the temperature. But as they pushed deeper, following the coordinates that Vance had extracted from Smith's journals, the symphony began to change. Not suddenly, not with a dramatic cessation that would have been noticeable, but gradually, note by note, voice by voice, until on the 5th day, Sarah realized that she could no longer hear the monkeys. The 6th day brought the absence of birdsong. By the 7th day, the insects were gone, and the only sound was the rustle of their own passage through the leaves, the chop of machetes, and the breathing of the team. "The silence," Vance whispered, and there was an excitement in his voice that Sarah found disturbing. Smith wrote about this. "The silence of the grove is not an absence but a presence. It presses against the ears like water against a diver. It is the silence of something that has consumed all other sound." "It's creepy," Olivier said, his joviality dampened by the weight of the quiet. "Like walking through a graveyard." Sarah said nothing, but she tightened her grip on the machete and began to watch the canopy with a vigilance that she had not needed since the time she had guided a team through poacher territory in the Itchery forest. It was on the 8th day that they saw the first curtains. They had made camp in a small clearing, a natural break in the canopy where a fallen giant had created a space for secondary growth. Sarah was setting up the tents while Vance wandered the perimeter with his acoustic interferometer, scanning for the vibrations that would indicate web structures. The porters were gathering firewood, though the wood was damp and reluctant to burn, and Thomas was staring upward with an expression that Sarah had learned to recognize as the prelude to fear. "What is it?" she asked him. He pointed. Above them, draped between the trees at the edge of the clearing, were sheets of something that looked like fabric. They were gray, translucent, and hung in folds that rippled slightly in the warm air rising from the forest floor. From a distance, they might have been mistaken for Spanish moss or the discarded nests of weaver birds. But up close, Sarah could see that they were silk. Massive sheets of spider silk, each one larger than a bedsheet, woven so finely that light passed through them in a way that made the world beyond look like an underwater scene viewed through murky water. "Webs," Vance breathed, rushing forward with his equipment. "Not webs, curtains." Smith called them curtains. "Look at the structure, they're not designed to catch insects. They're too large, too open. They're barriers." He was right. The silk sheets were arranged in patterns that suggested purpose rather than accident. They hung between specific trees, creating corridors and funnels that directed movement in particular directions. Sarah walked to the nearest one and extended her machete, touching the blade to the silk with the delicacy of a woman testing the depth of a frozen lake. The silk did not part. The machete, which had cut through inch-thick vines without hesitation, bounced off the webbing with a sound like a finger plucking a guitar string. The silk vibrated, sending ripples through the sheet that traveled outward in waves, and as the waves reached the edges of the curtain, they continued into the trees, carried along strands that Sarah could not see until the movement revealed them. "High tensile," Vance said, his voice hushed with awe. "Higher than anything I've ever measured. If this is natural silk, it's been evolved under pressures that we don't understand. The strength-to-weight ratio must be—" "We need to move," Sarah interrupted. "Now." "But the data—" "We need to move because this isn't a natural structure. It's a fence, and we're on the wrong side of it." She had seen enough hunting blinds to recognize the pattern. The curtains were not random. They were arranged to funnel prey toward a central point, to direct movement along paths that the hunter controlled. And if the hunter was large enough to require curtains the size of bedsheets, then the prey it was hunting was not insects. Vance opened his mouth to argue, but Jean Pierre's voice cut through the clearing with a sharpness that made them all turn. "There is something here," he said. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, near a wall of undergrowth that had seemed impenetrable moments before. "Something dead." They approached cautiously, Sarah in the lead with her machete raised, Vance behind her with his camera clutched like a talisman. The undergrowth parted, and they saw what Jean Pierre had found. It was a forest antelope, a small species that Sarah recognized as a duiker, though she could not identify the specific subspecies in the state it was in. The animal was suspended 4 feet off the ground, hanging in the center of a web that was not like the curtains they had seen. This web was circular, a perfect orb of radial threads and spiraling silk that caught the light in a way that made it shimmer like oil on water. The duiker was wrapped in the center, not in a cocoon but in a lattice of silk that held its limbs splayed in a posture of arrested flight. Its mouth was open, its eyes glazed and milky, and its body was intact. There were no wounds, no signs of predation, no indication that it had been eaten or even bitten. "It's being preserved," Vance said, his scientific curiosity momentarily overwhelming his caution. "The silk is wrapped around it in layers, but there's no compression. The web isn't crushing it, it's storing it, keeping it fresh." "Fresh for what?" Thomas asked, his voice barely audible. "For later," Sarah said, and the words felt like a judgment. "For when the hunter is hungry." Vance was taking photographs, his flash strobing in the gloom, recording the web from every angle. "Look at the reinforcement," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "The radial threads are double-woven. The spiral threads have a core of something darker, maybe a different protein structure. This isn't just a web, it's architecture, it's engineering." "We need to go around," Sarah said. "We need to find a path that doesn't lead past this thing." "But this is evidence," Vance protested. "This is proof that something large enough to catch a duiker is active in this area. We can't just walk away from." "We can and we will," Sarah snapped. "This isn't a documentary, Dr. Vance. This is survival. That animal is fresh. Hours old, maybe less. Which means whatever put it there is still nearby, and I don't want to be the next thing it decides to store for later." She turned to the porters, her voice dropping to the tone of command that had kept expeditions alive through worse situations than this. "Pack up. We're moving east around the clearing. Double time." They broke camp with a speed born of shared unease, packing their gear and moving out in a tight formation that Sarah led with her machete swinging in wide arcs to clear the path. Vance walked behind her, his head craned backward to stare at the canopy, his camera still in his hand but forgotten. The porters moved with the practiced silence of men who had learned that noise attracted attention, and Thomas brought up the rear, his eyes wide and darting, his hand never far from the machete at his hip. They walked for an hour, then two, pushing through undergrowth that grew progressively thicker, the vines wrapping around their ankles and the thorns catching at their clothing with a persistence that felt almost intentional. The canopy above grew denser, the light dimming to a perpetual twilight that made Sarah's eyes ache with the effort of distinguishing shapes. And the silence grew heavier, pressing against her eardrums like water pressure at depth. It was Thomas who stopped first. "The ground," he said, his voice strange and distant. "Feel the ground." Sarah stopped and looked down. She had been walking without paying attention to her feet, trusting her boots to handle whatever the jungle threw at them. But now, as she focused on the sensation, she realized that something was wrong. The ground beneath her was not solid. It was spongy, yielding like walking on a mattress or a thick carpet. With every step, her boots sank slightly and then rebounded, as if the earth itself were breathing. She knelt, ignoring the moisture that soaked through her pants, and scraped at the surface with her fingers. The top layer was leaf litter, the accumulated debris of decades of forest growth, dead leaves, twigs, bark fragments, the organic matter that formed the skin of the jungle floor. But beneath it, her fingers encountered something that was not soil. It was fibrous, elastic, and it stretched under her touch like the skin of a drum. "Sarah," Vance said, and his voice had changed. The excitement was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost like reverence. "Don't move." She looked up at him, then followed his gaze to the tree beside her. It was a massive hardwood, its trunk wrapped in lianas and moss, its roots spreading outward in thick buttresses that sank into the earth. And at the base of the tree, where the roots met the soil, there was a growth that Sarah had mistaken for fungus when she first glanced at it. But it was not fungus. It was silk. A thick, woven mat of gray silk that covered the roots and extended outward into the leaf litter, blending with it so perfectly that it was invisible until you looked directly at it. The mat was not confined to one tree. As Sarah's eyes adjusted, she saw that the entire forest floor was covered in it. The leaf litter was not leaf litter at all, but a camouflaged layer stretched over something beneath. A subterranean structure. A lair. "We're walking on it," she whispered. "We're walking on its house." "Not its house," Vance said, his voice barely audible. "Its web. The entire grove is a web. The curtains, the ground, the silence, it's all part of the same structure. Smith was right. They've terraformed the environment. They've turned the whole grove into a hunting ground." Sarah stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate, her weight distributed to avoid putting too much pressure on any single point. "How big?" "I don't know. From the satellite imagery, the dead zone was 2 kilometers across. If the web covers the whole area." 2 kilometers of spider web, Olivier said, and for the first time since Sarah had known him, there was no humor in his voice. "Mourned ya." "We move carefully," Sarah said. "Single file, no sudden movements. The web is sensitive to vibration, right? That's how spiders hunt, so we keep our steps light and we don't run." They formed a line, Sarah in the lead, Vance behind her, the porters following with expressions of terror that they were trying and failing to hide. They moved with the exaggerated slowness of men walking on ice, each step placed with precision, each breath controlled to minimize the expansion of their chests. The spongy ground sucked at their boots, resisting their passage, and Sarah imagined she could feel the web responding to their weight, sending signals through the fibers to a central mind that was cataloging their positions, their numbers, their movements. It took them 20 minutes to cover 100 meters. 20 minutes of sweating, trembling silence, broken only by the whisper of leaves and the creak of the web beneath them. Sarah's neck ached from the constant scanning of the canopy, her eyes searching for the shape that she knew was there, the shape that had been watching them since they entered the grove, waiting for the right moment to descend. She found the purple fungus at the base of a fallen log, and she nearly walked into it before she saw it. It was a cluster of growths, each one the size of a human fist, sprouting from the decaying wood in a pattern that reminded her of coral or the fruiting bodies of slime molds. But the color was wrong. It was purple, a deep violet that seemed to glow with its own luminescence in the dim light of the forest floor, and it smelled of something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. "Don't touch it," Vance warned, but he was too late. Elias Vance, the man who had spent 3 years dreaming of this moment, who had crossed oceans and sacrificed his reputation for the chance to stand in this exact spot, reached out with his sampling kit to collect a specimen of the purple growth. His foot shifted, his weight transferred, and beneath the leaf litter, something twanged like a guitar string snapped under tension. "Tripwire," Sarah screamed, but the word had barely left her lips when the canopy erupted. The J'ba Fofi did not descend. It dropped. One moment the canopy was a tangle of leaves and vines and shadow, and the next it was filled with a shape that was so large it should not have been able to move with such speed. It was a mass of bristled black hair and chitin, 6 feet in diameter from leg to leg, with an abdomen that was swollen and segmented and marked with a pattern that Sarah's brain refused to process. The legs were thick as her wrist, jointed in ways that seemed to defy geometry, and the front two ended in claws that screeched against the bark as the creature landed on the log where Vance had been standing. Vance was on the ground, knocked aside by the wind of the creature's passage, his sampling kit scattered in the leaf litter. He stared upward with an expression that was not terror, but awe, the face of a man who had found his god and discovered that it was hungry. "Beautiful," he whispered. The J'ba Fofi turned toward him, its cluster of eyes, 8 of them, arranged in 2 rows of 4, each one a polished obsidian that reflected Sarah's terrified face, focusing on the man at its feet. It raised its front legs, the claws spreading wide, and made a sound that was like the rustling of dry leaves mixed with the clicking of castanets. It was a sound of assessment, of evaluation, of a predator deciding whether its prey was worth the effort of capture. Then it struck. The J'ba Fofi did not bite. That was the first thing Sarah noticed. even as her body was moving without conscious command, her machete raised in a defensive posture that she knew was laughably inadequate against a creature that weighed as much as she did, and was armored in chitin that had deflected her blade earlier without effort. The spider slammed its front legs into the log where Vance had been lying, not with the precision of a killing strike, but with the force of a demolition hammer, splintering the wood and sending fragments flying in a spray of bark and moss. Vance rolled sideways, his scientist's instinct for preservation overcoming his awe, and the claws missed him by inches, burying themselves in the forest floor with a sound like axes striking wet earth. "Run!" Sarah screamed, though she knew even as she said it that running was exactly what the web was designed to prevent. The spongy ground would transmit every footstep, every vibration, directly to the creature's sensory organs. Running would be a signal flare, a declaration of prey behavior that would trigger pursuit instincts older than human fear. But Jean-Pierre was already moving, his long legs carrying him backward in a scramble that was more falling than fleeing, and Moise had dropped his pack and was sprinting in the opposite direction, his silence shattered by a high-pitched keening that emerged from his throat without his consent. Olivier grabbed Thomas by the arm and dragged him toward the undergrowth, their boots tearing through the leaf litter and exposing the silk beneath in torn ribbons. The J'ba Fofi did not pursue them immediately. It remained standing on the log, its body rocking slightly from side to side in a motion that was almost contemplative, its eyes tracking each of the fleeing humans with the dispassionate efficiency of a targeting computer. Then it moved, and Sarah understood that she had never truly comprehended speed until that moment. It covered the distance to Moise in a single leap, its legs extending and contracting in a fluid motion that made the air whistle around its body. Moise had time to turn, time to raise his arms in a gesture of pathetic defense, and then the spider was on him, not biting but grabbing, its front legs wrapping around his torso with a grip that Sarah could hear from 20 meters away, the sound of ribs flexing under pressure, of breath being expelled in a sharp grunt. The J'ba Fofi lifted Moise off the ground as if he weighed nothing, raised him to the level of its eyes, and then slammed him against the trunk of a hardwood tree with a force that Sarah felt as a vibration in her own chest. The wet snap that followed was not the breaking of a single bone, but the collapse of a structure, the simultaneous failure of spine and pelvis and shoulder girdle under impact forces that no human body was designed to survive. Moise did not scream. He made a sound like a bag of wet cement being dropped from a height, and then he was silent, his body folding in on itself in a posture that was no longer human, dangling from the spider's grip like a broken puppet. But the J'ba Fofi did not eat him. It did not tear into his flesh or drain his fluids. It carried him to a tree on the edge of the clearing, one of the massive hardwoods that supported the canopy, and began to wrap him. The silk emerged from spinnerets at the rear of its abdomen in thick cords that were almost white in the dim light, each one as thick as a pencil and glistening with a mucus coating that hardened almost instantly upon contact with air. The spider worked with a mechanical efficiency that was horrifying in its deliberateness, spinning Moise's body in a cocoon that was not tight but structured, leaving gaps for air, preserving the form while immobilizing the limbs. Within minutes, Moise was suspended 4 feet off the ground, identical to the diker they had found earlier, a stored commodity awaiting consumption. "It's not killing them," Vance whispered. He had crawled to Sarah's side, his face pale and streaked with dirt, his hands shaking but his eyes bright with the fever of discovery. "It's preserving them. The silk must contain an anesthetic or a preservative compound. It keeps the prey alive but immobile, fresh." "Moise is dead," Sarah hissed. "I heard his spine break." "Maybe, maybe not." Smith's journals mentioned a fever that afflicted victims who were bitten but not immediately consumed. He thought it was malaria, but what if it's a neurotoxin? Something that induces paralysis while maintaining metabolic function. "I don't care what it is," Sarah said. "I care about getting out of here before we're all pantry items." The J'ba Fofi had finished wrapping Moise and was turning its attention back to the clearing. Its eyes swept across the undergrowth where Jean-Pierre, Olivier, and Thomas had vanished, and then they settled on Sarah and Vance with a focus that made her skin feel like it was being peeled away. "Don't move," Vance breathed. "Predators respond to movement if we're still." "That's for animals," Sarah said. "This thing is smarter than that. Look at the web. Look at the way it hunts. It's not acting on instinct, it's making choices." She was right, and the proof came a moment later when the spider did not charge them. Instead, it began to circle, moving in a wide arc that kept them in sight while positioning itself between them and the direction from which they had come. It was hurting them, cutting off retreat. The same behavior Sarah had seen in lions on the Serengeti, in wolves in the Canadian North, in every apex predator that understood the value of patience and positioning. "It's driving us deeper," she said, "into the grove." "Then we go deeper," Vance said, and there was a madness in his voice that frightened her more than the spider. "If it wants us to go that way, maybe that's where the data is. Maybe that's where we find the alpha, the specimen that will prove everything." "You're insane," Sarah said. "This thing just killed Moise and you're talking about finding the alpha." "Moise is not dead. Not yet. And if we can document this species, if we can bring back evidence that the J'ba Fofi is real, it won't matter what we lost. It will matter what we found." Sarah stared at him, at the man who had once been a respected academic and was now something broken and reassembled around a single obsession. She realized then that she had made a mistake in agreeing to this expedition, not because the danger was greater than she had anticipated, but because her employer was no longer capable of understanding danger as anything other than an obstacle to discovery. "I'm going to survive," she said, "with or without you, but I'm not going to let that thing herd me like cattle." She turned and plunged into the undergrowth, not running but moving with a controlled speed that she hoped would minimize her vibrations on the web. Vance followed, his footsteps heavier, his breathing loud enough to drown out the silence. Behind them, the J'ba Fofi clicked its mandibles together and began to pursue, not with leaps but with a scuttling gait that carried it through the underbrush with a fluidity that should have been impossible for something so large. They ran for what felt like hours but was probably minutes, the spongy ground sucking at their boots, the curtains of silk brushing against their faces like the fingers of drowned men. The jungle had become a maze, the natural paths obscured by webbing that redirected them in loops and spirals, and Sarah began to understand that they were not merely in a grove where spiders lived. They were inside the spider. The entire forest was an extension of its body, its nerves, its hunting instinct. It was Thomas who found the root cavern. He had become separated from Olivier in the flight, and when Sarah and Vance stumbled into a natural hollow at the base of a massive strangler fig, he was already there, huddled against the roots with his knees drawn to his chest and his eyes wide and unseeing. "Thomas," Sarah said, crouching beside him, "Thomas, are you hurt?" He turned his head slowly, and she saw that his pupils were dilated to the point where the irises were barely visible black pools that reflected nothing. "It sings," he whispered. "The spider sings. Can you hear it?" Sarah listened. Above the sound of her own heartbeat, above Vance's ragged breathing, above the distant rustle of the J'ba Fofi moving through the undergrowth, there was indeed a sound. Not a song exactly, but a vibration, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the ground itself, traveling through the root systems and the webbing and the very air. It was the sound of something communicating across distances that human ears could not measure, a language of pressure and tension that spoke of position and intention and hunger. "He's in shock," Vance said, though his voice suggested he was not entirely certain. "Or he's been bitten. The neurotoxin." "He's terrified," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference, and right now we all need to be terrified, because that thing is still out there and it's not going to stop until it has us all wrapped up like leftovers." But Vance was not listening. He had crawled to the entrance of the hollow and was staring at the root system with an intensity that bordered on religious ecstasy. The roots of the strangler fig did not end at the soil. They continued downward, sinking into the earth in thick cables that vanished into darkness, and between the roots there were gaps. Not random spaces created by erosion, but deliberate openings, tunnels that had been widened and reinforced with silk. The root cavern was not a natural formation. It was an entrance. The lair, Vance breathed. Smith wrote about this. Beneath the sacred grove, the roots form a cathedral of hollows where the mothers sleep and the young are born. This is where they live. This is where they breed. "I'm not going in there," Sarah said flatly. "We don't have a choice. The spider is outside. It's herding us toward this exact spot. If we stay here, it will come for us. If we go inside, maybe we can find another way out. A back entrance, something. Or maybe we'll be walking straight into the nursery, into the heart of the web." Vance turned to her, and in the dim light that filtered through the canopy, his face looked like a skull, all hollows and shadows and the gleam of teeth. "Isn't that exactly where we want to be?" Sarah wanted to hit him. She wanted to grab him by the shoulders and shake him until the obsession fell out like loose teeth. But she could hear the J'ba Fofi approaching, the clicking of its legs on bark and stone, and she knew that standing in the open was not an option. If there was a chance, however slim, that the root caverns offered an escape route, she had to take it. "Fine," she said, "but we stay together, no wandering off, no collecting samples, and if I say we turn back, we turn back." "Agreed," Vance said, though she did not believe him. They helped Thomas to his feet, supporting him between them, and descended into the root caverns. The entrance was narrow, a gap between two roots that forced them to crawl on their hands and knees, but it widened quickly into a tunnel that was large enough to walk upright. The walls were lined with silk, not in thick sheets but in a lacework that held the soil in place and created a surface that was strangely smooth, almost polished. The air was cooler underground, and the smell was different, not the fungal decay of the forest floor but a scent that reminded Sarah of old books and dried flowers, a preservation smell, the odor of things kept too long in dark places. The tunnel branched and branched again, forming a network that seemed to follow the root system of the fig tree above, each branch leading deeper into the earth. They moved without light, Vance having lost his flashlight in the flight, relying on the faint bioluminescence of fungi that grew on the silk-lined walls. The glow was purple, Sarah realized, the same shade as the growths they had seen on the forest floor, and it cast everything in a hue that made her feel like she was walking through a bruise. "The colonial structure," Vance whispered, his voice echoing in the tunnels. Smith mentioned it in the later journal entries. He thought he was seeing multiple individuals, but he couldn't understand how they interacted. "They move as one," he wrote. "They hunt as one, they build as one." I thought he was describing a social spider like the colonial spiders in the Amazon. But what if it's more than that? What if they're not just social but truly colonial like ants or bees? A hive mind, a distributed organism. "Distributed organism," Thomas repeated, his voice dreamy and distant. "Yes, the many and the one, the web and the spider." Sarah shivered, and not from the cold. Thomas's words had an uncomfortable resonance with the vibration she could still feel in the walls, the hum that was growing stronger as they descended. The root caverns were not empty. They were full of life, full of movement, full of the sense of being watched by eyes that were not human and did not blink. They emerged into a chamber that was larger than any they had seen, a vaulted space where the root systems converged in a dome that rose 20 meters above their heads. The walls were covered in silk, not in sheets but in structures, platforms, alcoves, shelves upon which were arranged objects that Sarah's brain refused to identify at first, and then identified with a surge of nausea that made her gag. They were bodies, not human bodies or not entirely human. Animal carcasses mostly, monkeys, birds, a small leopard, wrapped in silk cocoons and suspended from the walls in patterns that suggested organization rather than random storage. Each cocoon was intact, each body preserved in a posture of suspended animation, and from several of them, Sarah could see movement. Not the movement of life, but the movement of something growing inside, something that fed on the stored flesh and left the skin intact as a container. "Nursery," Vance said, his voice hushed. "The cocoons aren't just storage, they're incubators. The spiders don't just preserve their prey, they use them as hosts for their young." "That's impossible," Sarah said, though the evidence was before her eyes. "Spiders don't lay eggs in other animals, they lay eggs in egg sacs." "Most spiders don't," Vance agreed. "But parasitoid behavior exists in other species. Wasps that lay eggs in caterpillars, flies that lay eggs in snails. What if the J'ba Fofi has evolved a similar strategy? What if the silk doesn't just preserve the prey but prepares it, modifies it chemically to serve as a host?" "Then Moise." "Moise is not food. Not yet, he's a nursery." Sarah turned away from the cocoons, her stomach heaving, and found herself facing the center of the chamber. There was a structure there, a platform raised above the floor on legs of woven silk, and upon it sat a shape that was larger than the J'ba Fofi they had encountered above. Much larger. Its abdomen was swollen to the size of a water barrel, and its legs extended outward in a span that covered the entire platform. But it was not moving. It was resting, its body motionless, its eyes closed or hidden beneath lids that Sarah had not known spiders possessed. And on its abdomen, visible even in the dim purple light, was a mark, a patch of coloration that was not black like the rest of its body, but a deep, rich violet, almost luminescent, shaped in a pattern that resembled an eye or a flower or a wound. "The purple mark," Vance breathed. Smith described it, "the mark of the mother, the sign of the colony." "It's a pheromone gland," Sarah said, the realization coming to her with a clarity that surprised her. "I read about it once. In colonial insects, the queen produces pheromones that regulate the behavior of the colony. The workers respond to her scent. They can't function without it. What if the purple mark is the same thing? What if it's not just a marking but an organ, a chemical signaling system that coordinates the entire grove?" "Then if we could analyze it," Vance said, "if we could understand the chemical structure, we might be able to disrupt it, confuse them, make them attack each other." "Or make them attack us with even more determination," Sarah countered. "We don't know what we're dealing with, Dr. Vance, and every time you suggest analyzing something, someone else dies." The argument was interrupted by a sound from above, a clicking and rustling that suggested multiple legs moving across silk. Sarah looked up and her blood ran cold. The ceiling of the chamber was not solid. It was a web, a massive, interlocking network of threads that spanned the entire vault, and upon it dozens of shapes were moving. Not the size of the mother on the platform, but smaller, still large enough to dwarf any terrestrial spider, their bodies black and their legs bristled, and their eyes reflecting the purple light in a scatter of malignant jewels. "We're in the hive," Sarah whispered. "We're in the heart of the web." The spiders on the ceiling began to descend, not dropping but climbing down the walls on threads of silk that they spun as they moved, rappelling toward the floor with a speed that was horrifying in its precision. There were too many to count, a swarm that filled the chamber with the sound of chitin on silk and the smell of something sweet and rotten. "The tunnel," Sarah screamed, grabbing Vance and Thomas by their arms and dragging them toward the nearest exit. "Move, move now." They ran through the root caverns with the swarm behind them, the clicking of pursuing legs echoing through the tunnels in a chorus of predatory excitement. Sarah had lost all sense of direction, all hope of finding an exit, and she ran purely on instinct, taking turns at random, plunging deeper into the labyrinth with the awareness that every step was carrying them further from the surface and closer to the center of the colony's power. They burst into another chamber, smaller than the nursery but no less terrifying, and Sarah saw immediately that they had reached a dead end. The chamber was circular, the walls converging in a dome that was entirely covered in silk, and the floor was a single sheet of webbing that looked fragile but had already demonstrated its strength. In the center of the chamber, suspended from the ceiling by a single thread, was a shape that made Sarah's heart stop. It was Olivier, the jovial porter, the teller of jokes, the man who had made them laugh on the river. He was wrapped in silk, not in a cocoon but in a shroud, his body hanging upside down with his arms spread in a posture that suggested crucifixion. His eyes were open, and as Sarah watched, they moved, tracking her with a consciousness that was horrifying in its clarity. He was alive, paralyzed, preserved, but alive, and he was not alone. Suspended around him, in a circle that covered the entire chamber, were dozens of other shapes. Animals mostly, but also, Sarah's mind rebelled against the identification, but her eyes were certain, also human. A hunter in khaki clothing, his body desiccated and mummified by the preservative properties of the silk. A woman in a tattered dress, her face frozen in a rictus of silent screaming. A child, small and frail, wrapped in so many layers of thread that only the outline of its body was visible. "The heart of the web," Vance said, and his voice was no longer excited. It was hollow, emptied of everything except the recognition of mortality. "This is where they bring the ones they want to keep, the special ones, the ones that will serve as hosts for the most important broods." "We're going to die here," Thomas said, and his voice was calm, the calm of a man who had accepted his fate and found it not as terrible as he had imagined. "We're going to die here, and they're going to wrap us up, and our bodies will hang here until the eggs hatch and eat their way out. And no one will ever know. No one will ever find us." "No," Sarah said, and the word surprised her with its force. "No, I am not dying in a spider's pantry. I am not becoming an incubator for nightmares. We are going to get out of here, and we are going to burn this place to the ground, and we are going to make sure that no one else ever walks into this trap." She looked around the chamber, her mind racing through possibilities, through options, through desperate plans that formed and dissolved in fractions of seconds. The web covered the floor, but it was thin here, not reinforced like the curtains above. The walls were silk-lined but not solid. If they could cut through, if they could find a weak point, if they could create a distraction. The J'ba Fofi that entered the chamber was not the one from the forest. It was larger, its abdomen swollen with the same purple mark that they had seen on the mother, and its movements were slower, more deliberate, the movements of an aristocrat entering a dining room. It was the alpha female, the queen, the heart of the web itself. It paused in the entrance, its eyes sweeping across the chamber, across the suspended forms of its previous victims, across Sarah and Vance and Thomas huddled in the center like mice in a trap. And then it moved toward them, not rushing but advancing with the terrible patience of something that had never known defeat, something that had ruled this grove for generations and would continue to rule it until the forest itself turned to dust. "Sarah," Vance whispered, "the purple mark, look at the purple mark." She looked. The mark on the alpha's abdomen was not merely a coloration. It was pulsing, expanding and contracting in a rhythm that matched the vibrations in the walls, the hum that was the colony's voice. As the alpha moved, the mark released a fine mist, a spray of particles that caught the purple light and shimmered like dust motes in a sunbeam. Pheromones, the chemical language of the colony, signaling the other spiders, coordinating the hunt, declaring that the queen had found her prey and that the feast was about to begin. "It's calling them," Sarah said. "It's telling them to come, to witness, to feed." "Then we need to stop it from calling," Vance said. "We need to disrupt the signal." "How?" Vance reached into his pocket and pulled out the device that Sarah had seen him carry since the beginning of the expedition. The portable emergency flare, a high-intensity whistle that produced a sound at frequencies designed to disorient animals and signal rescue teams. He had used it once on the river, to scare off a crocodile that had approached their boat, and Sarah remembered the way the creature had recoiled. its sensory organs overwhelmed by the piercing shriek. "Spiders sense vibrations," Vance said, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the device. "They hunt by vibration. They communicate by vibration. What if we overload their senses? What if we create a vibration so intense, so chaotic that they can't process it?" "It'll bring every spider in the grove down on us," Sarah said. "They're already coming," Vance replied. "At least this way we choose when." He activated the flare. The sound that emerged was not a whistle but a shriek, a high-frequency blast that filled the chamber with a pressure wave that Sarah felt in her teeth, her bones, her very core. It was like standing inside a bell while it was being struck, the resonance traveling through her body and making her vision blur. The alpha female reared back, its legs splaying outward in a posture of distress, its eye cluster twitching and jerking as the sensory overload assaulted its nervous system. But the effect was not limited to the alpha. Throughout the chamber, throughout the root caverns, throughout the entire grove, the spiders were responding. Sarah could hear them, could feel them through the web beneath her feet. Dozens of creatures, hundreds perhaps, all reacting to the disruption of their sensory network with a confusion that bordered on panic. They were clicking, hissing, thrashing, their coordinated behavior fragmenting into individual chaos. "Now," Vance screamed, though Sarah could barely hear him over the whistle, "cut through the wall." She didn't need to be told twice. She drew her machete and hacked at the silk-covered wall of the chamber, the blade biting into the lacework with a resistance that was less than she had expected. The silk was strong, but it was designed to catch and hold, not to resist lateral cutting. She carved a vertical slash, then a horizontal one, creating a gap large enough to crawl through, and she grabbed Thomas by the collar and shoved him toward it. "Go, follow the roots upward." Thomas scrambled through the gap, his paralyzed terror momentarily overcome by the instinct for survival. Vance followed, the flare still shrieking in his hand, and Sarah was the last out, throwing herself through the gap just as the alpha female recovered enough to strike. A claw caught her boot, tearing through the leather and leaving a gouge in the sole, but she was through, rolling in the dirt of a side tunnel and coming up running. They sprinted through the root caverns with the sound of pursuit behind them, the chaos of the colony gradually giving way to a new kind of coordination, a rage that was hotter and more personal than the cold efficiency of the hunt. The alpha was angry, and an angry predator was a dangerous predator. The tunnel began to slope upward, and Sarah felt a surge of hope that was almost painful in its intensity. The roots around them were getting thicker, closer to the surface, and the air was changing, becoming fresher, carrying the scent of leaf litter and open sky. They were close. They were almost out. Then Thomas stumbled. He had been running ahead of them, his steps uneven but determined, and his foot caught on a root that protruded from the tunnel wall. He fell forward with a cry that was cut short as his body hit the ground and rolled, coming to rest against a mass of roots that had formed a natural cage. Before Sarah could reach him, before she could extend her hand to pull him up, the ceiling of the tunnel moved. It was not the ceiling. It was a spider, smaller than the alpha but still large enough to crush a man's skull with its legs, that had been clinging to the roots above and had dropped at the sound of Thomas's fall. It landed on the tunnel floor with a heavy thump, its body blocking the passage, its eyes fixed on Thomas with the single-minded hunger of a creature that had not eaten in days. Thomas tried to crawl backward, but his legs were tangled in the roots, and his arms flailed uselessly against the silk that coated the tunnel walls. The spider advanced, its front legs raised, and then it struck with a speed that was too fast to follow, not biting but wrapping, spinning silk around Thomas's legs with a mechanical efficiency that was horrifying in its precision. "No," Sarah screamed, lunging forward with her machete. But the spider was not interested in her. It had its prey, and it was working quickly, wrapping Thomas's torso, his arms, his neck, leaving only his face exposed in a cocoon that was tightening with every revolution. Thomas's eyes met Sarah's, and in them she saw not terror but resignation, The acceptance of a fate that he had known was waiting for him since the moment he had signed on to this expedition. "Run," he whispered, and then the silk covered his mouth and he was silent. Sarah stood frozen, her machete raised, her body caught between the impulse to fight and the knowledge that fighting was futile. The spider finished its wrapping and dragged Thomas's cocooned body upward, disappearing into a side tunnel with a speed that suggested it had a destination in mind, a storage shelf where the fresh host would be hung until the eggs were ready. "Sarah," Vance was pulling at her arm, his face contorted with panic. "We have to go now." She let him pull her, her legs moving mechanically, her mind numb with the horror of what she had just witnessed. They ran upward, following the slope of the tunnel, and gradually the roots gave way to soil, and the soil gave way to leaf litter, and they burst into the open air of the forest with a gasp that was almost a sob. But the grove was not done with them. The forest was not a forest anymore. It was a throat, and they were being swallowed. Sarah and Vance burst from the tunnel into what should have been the open air of the jungle, but the canopy above had closed in completely, the trees leaning toward each other at angles that suggested intention rather than growth, their branches interwoven with curtains of silk that formed a ceiling hundreds of feet above. The ground beneath their feet was not soil but a floor of webbing, a suspended platform of silk stretched between the trees like a circus tent. And as Sarah took her first step, she felt it sag beneath her weight, bouncing and trembling with a resonance that traveled outward in concentric ripples. "This is it," Vance breathed, and his voice was not afraid but reverent, the tone of a man who had found the temple he had been searching for all his life. The heart of the web, Smith described it, the central arena, the hunting ground. Sarah wanted to scream at him, to tell him that this was not a discovery but a death sentence, but her breath was gone, her lungs burning from the run through the tunnels, and her legs were shaking with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through the silk ceiling, and she saw that they were standing in a space that defied her understanding of the natural world. It was a circular clearing, perhaps 100 meters in diameter, enclosed by walls of webbing that rose in spiraling sheets to the canopy above. The floor was entirely covered in silk, a thick carpet of thread that had been woven so densely it formed a surface that was almost solid, almost walkable. But it was not solid. Sarah could see through it in places, could see the gaps between the threads and the darkness that waited below, and she understood with a clarity that made her dizzy that the floor was not a floor at all. It was a trap, a massive, circular web suspended over a pit or a lower level of the grove, designed to catch anything that walked upon it and hold it until the hunters arrived. And they were not alone in the arena. Suspended from the ceiling of silk, hanging like obscene fruit from the branches of an invisible tree, were the remains of the colony's previous victims. Sarah recognized some of them, animals mostly, antelope and monkeys and birds, but there were other shapes that her mind refused to identify until she was forced to acknowledge them. Human shapes. Jean-Pierre, his long legs tucked against his chest in a fetal position, wrapped in silk that left only his face exposed, his eyes open and tracking with a consciousness that was worse than death. Another figure, smaller, that might have been a child or a woman, the features obscured by the layers of thread. And other forms, dozens of them, arranged in a spiral pattern that converged on the center of the arena, where a depression in the webbing suggested a place of importance, a throne or an altar or a nest. "We can't cross this," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "One step and they'll know exactly where we are." "We don't have a choice," Vance replied, pointing to the far side of the arena where a gap in the webbing suggested an exit, a passage through the silk walls that might lead to the river, to safety, to the world beyond the grove. "Look at the structure. The web is designed to funnel prey toward the center. If we stay near the edges, move quickly and lightly, we might make it across before they respond." "Might," Sarah repeated. "That's not a plan, Dr. Vance, that's a prayer." "Then pray," he said, and he stepped onto the web. The surface trembled beneath his foot, sending vibrations through the threads that Sarah could see as waves of distortion in the silk. But the tremor was small, localized, and it died out within seconds as Vance shifted his weight and moved forward with the exaggerated care of a man walking on ice. He took another step, then another, each one placed with precision, each one sending out ripples that were smaller than the last as he learned to move with the web rather than against it. Sarah followed, her machete held in front of her like a talisman, her eyes fixed on the exit and her peripheral vision scanning the ceiling for movement. The suspended forms above them swayed gently in the warm air that rose from the jungle floor, and she tried not to look at Jean Pierre's face, tried not to see the expression of awareness that was frozen there, the knowledge of his own immobility and the waiting. They were halfway across the arena when the first porter fell. It was not Jean Pierre. He was already suspended and beyond help. It was a man Sarah had not seen since the initial flight from the J'ba Fofi above ground, one of the local guides who had been separated from the group and had apparently wandered into the arena from another entrance. He was running, his steps heavy and panicked, and the web responded to his passage like a drumhead struck with a hammer. The vibrations were massive, unavoidable, and they traveled to the center of the arena and back in waves that Sarah could feel in her own feet. From the ceiling, from the walls, from the silk itself, the spiders came. They were smaller than the alpha, these hunters, but they were numerous, a dozen or more descending on threads that gleamed in the dim light like fishing lines cast by angels of death. They dropped onto the running man with a coordination that was horrifying in its precision. Not one spider but three, their legs interlocking as they surrounded him and began the process of immobilization. He screamed, a sound that was cut short as silk was sprayed across his face, and then he was down, thrashing on the web in a way that only made the vibrations stronger, that only summoned more hunters from the shadows. "Don't look," Vance hissed, "keep moving." But Sarah could not help but look, and what she saw would be etched into her memory until the day she died. The spiders were not killing the man. They were processing him, working with a division of labor that suggested a social structure far beyond anything known in the arachnid world. One spider wrapped his legs. Another wrapped his torso. A third positioned itself at his head, not attacking but observing, its eyes tracking his struggles with a patience that suggested it was waiting for something specific, waiting for exhaustion, waiting for the moment when the prey's movements would cease and the preservation could begin. The man went still, and the spiders lifted him, carrying him to the ceiling on threads that they spun as they climbed, adding him to the spiral of suspended forms with a gentleness that was more obscene than violence would have been. "One by one," Sarah whispered. "They're picking us off one by one." "Then we don't give them the chance," Vance said, and he began to move faster, his steps still careful but his pace increasing, driven by the terror of what they had just witnessed. Sarah followed, her own fear propelling her across the trembling web, and they were 3/4 of the way to the exit when she felt it. The web beneath her right foot was different. Not uniform like the rest of the surface, but thicker, reinforced, and as she shifted her weight, she felt it give way with a suddenness that suggested design rather than decay. A trapdoor, a concealed gap in the webbing that had been covered with a thin layer of silk to disguise its true nature. She fell. Not far. The gap was only a meter deep, a pocket in the webbing that had been woven to catch and hold. But the fall was enough to twist her ankle, to send her sprawling on her stomach with her arms splayed in front of her and her machete spinning away across the silk. She tried to rise, but her foot was caught, tangled in the threads that lined the pocket, and as she struggled, she felt the silk tightening, responding to her movements by contracting like a muscle. "Sarah!" Vance was at the edge of the pocket, reaching for her hand, but before their fingers could touch, the web above them moved. The J'ba Fofi that descended from the ceiling was the alpha. Sarah knew it even before she saw the purple mark pulsing on its abdomen, knew it by the size and the deliberateness of its movement, by the way the other spiders retreated to the edges of the arena to make room for its arrival. It dropped on a single thread, repelling with a grace that was almost beautiful, and landed on the web beside the pocket where Sarah was trapped with a weight that made the entire surface sag. Vance stumbled backward, his hands raised in a gesture of helplessness, and Sarah saw the calculation in his eyes. He could run. The exit was meters away. He could sprint for it, leave her behind, survive to tell the story of the expedition and the monster in the grove. She saw him consider it, saw the temptation flicker across his face like a shadow, and then she saw him reject it. Not out of courage, she thought later, but out of obsession. He could not let her die because he needed her to validate what he had found. Without a witness, the J'ba Fofi was just another story, another legend, another ghost in the machine of his ruined reputation. "Stay still," he whispered, though whether he was talking to her or to himself, Sarah could not tell. The alpha approached the pocket where Sarah lay trapped, its legs moving in a slow, deliberate gait that tested the web with each step, that distributed its weight with a precision that suggested centuries of evolution dedicated to this exact behavior. It reached the edge and paused, its eye cluster sweeping across Sarah's body with an assessment that was almost clinical, evaluating her size, her health, her suitability as a host. Then it began to wrap her. The silk emerged not from the rear of the abdomen, as Sarah had expected, but from structures near the mouth, spinnerets that were positioned for close work, for the delicate application of thread to a captive that was too close to be sprayed. The alpha extended one leg and touched Sarah's ankle, not with a claw but with the tip of a limb that was smoother than she had imagined, almost gentle, and she felt the silk begin to wind around her foot. It was not violent. That was the horror of it. The wrapping was methodical, almost tender, the spider rotating her leg with one limb while another applied the thread in neat spirals that moved upward from ankle to knee. The silk was warm, almost hot, and it hardened almost instantly upon contact with her skin, forming a bandage that was also a shackle. Sarah tried to kick, but her movements only made the spider work faster, the vibrations of her struggle signaling the need for more restraint. "Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking, "please." Vance was frozen, his eyes darting between Sarah and the alpha, his hands empty and useless at his sides. The portable flare was in his pocket, but he had dropped it in the fall, and it lay on the web meters away, beyond his reach. The alpha continued its work, moving up Sarah's body, wrapping her thighs, her hips, her waist, each layer of silk tightening her prison until she could barely breathe, until her chest was compressed in a corset of thread that forced her to take shallow, panicked gasps. "The sensory organs," Vance said suddenly, and his voice had changed, had become the voice of the scientist again, the man who observed rather than participated. "The J'ba Fofi hunts by vibration. The eyes are secondary. The primary sense is tactile, through the legs, through the web, if I can disrupt the vibration." He moved not toward the flare but toward the alpha itself, his steps light and quick, his body language submissive, non-threatening. The spider paused in its wrapping, one leg raised in a posture of warning, but Vance did not attack. He reached out and touched the web beside the alpha's foot, his fingers plucking at the threads like a musician tuning an instrument. The alpha twitched. Its legs splayed outward and it made a sound, a hiss, a click, a vibration that Sarah felt in her bones rather than heard with her ears. It was a sound of confusion, of distress, of a creature that was receiving information it could not process. "The web is its nervous system," Vance said, his voice rising with excitement. "If I can introduce a counterfrequency, if I can create interference." He pulled the emergency flare from his pocket. He had not dropped it after all, or he had recovered it in his scramble backward, and now he held it in both hands like a priest holding a chalice. He activated it, and the shriek filled the arena with a pressure wave that made Sarah's vision blur and her teeth ache. But this time, the effect was different. This time, Vance was not using the flare randomly. He was using it strategically, directing the sound toward the web itself, creating a pattern of vibrations that conflicted with the natural resonance of the silk. The alpha reared back, its legs flailing, its eye cluster twitching in spasms that suggested sensory overload. It could not see the sound, could not smell it, could not escape it, and its nervous system, evolved over millions of years to process the subtle vibrations of prey and predator, was overwhelmed by the chaos. "Now," Vance screamed, "pull free." Sarah strained against the silk that bound her, her muscles screaming with the effort, her lungs burning for air. The wrapping was tight, but it was fresh, not yet fully hardened, and as the alpha flailed above her, distracted by the assault on its senses, she found a weak point where the threads had not fully overlapped. She pushed her fingers into the gap, tearing at the silk with a desperation that gave her strength beyond her normal limits, and the bandage around her chest ripped with a sound like canvas tearing. She rolled sideways out of the pocket onto the webbing beyond, and the alpha struck at the space where she had been, its claws burying themselves in the silk and tearing a hole that revealed the darkness below. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her ankles screaming with pain but functional, and she grabbed her machete from where it had fallen, raising it in a two-handed grip that was more reflex than intention. "Run!" Vance shouted, and he was already moving, the flare still shrieking in his hand, its sound creating a corridor of confusion through which the spiders could not navigate. "The exit! Go!" They ran across the heart of the web with the alpha thrashing behind them, its movements erratic and uncoordinated, its colony momentarily fragmented by the disruption of their queen's senses. The other spiders, the smaller hunters that had been waiting at the edges of the arena, were also affected, their coordination shattered by the chaos in their network, and they struck at empty air or at each other in a frenzy of misdirected aggression. Sarah reached the exit first, a tear in the silk wall that led to a corridor of vegetation beyond, and she turned to help Vance through. He was slower, his scientific mind still trying to observe even as his body fled, his head turning back to stare at the alpha with an expression that was half terror, half longing. "Come on," Sarah screamed, grabbing his arm and hauling him through the gap. "It's not a specimen, Elias, it's a monster, and if you don't move, it's going to kill you." They burst through the silk wall and into the jungle beyond, the heart of the web falling away behind them like a nightmare dissolving in daylight. But the jungle was not safe. The grove was still the grove, and the web still covered the ground, and the spiders were still hunting. They ran through corridors of silk and vegetation, the curtains brushing against their faces, the spongy ground threatening to betray them with every step. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew louder as the alpha recovered from the sensory assault and resumed her coordination of the colony. "The river," Sarah gasped, her lungs on fire, her ankle sending jolts of pain up her leg with every stride. "If we can reach the river, the water will break the trail. They won't follow into running water." "How far?" Vance asked. "I don't know, maybe 2 kilometers, maybe 3. "We won't make it," Vance said, but he ran anyway because the alternative was to stop, and to stop was to die. They ran through the jungle with a desperation that stripped away caution, crashing through undergrowth, tearing through silk curtains, their boots sinking into the spongy webbing and pulling free with sucking sounds that were loud enough to guide any predator with ears. Sarah's machete swung in wild arcs, clearing a path that closed behind them as quickly as it opened, the vegetation seeming to reach for them with grasping fingers. Behind them, the clicking of chitin on bark grew louder. The alpha was not alone. The entire colony was mobilizing, a wave of black bodies and purple marks flowing through the grove with a single-minded hunger that was older than human fear. Sarah could hear them in the canopy above, could feel them in the vibrations of the web beneath her feet, could smell them in the air, a scent like rotting flowers and ozone, the signature of a species that had never been catalogued because no one who encountered it had survived to file the paperwork. "There," Vance screamed, pointing ahead. Through the trees, through the curtains of silk, Sarah saw a shimmer that was not webbing but water. The river. The Lualaba, or one of its tributaries, a ribbon of brown water that cut through the jungle like a vein, carrying life and death in equal measure. And on the river, moving slowly against the current, was a boat. It was a fishing boat, a wooden pirogue with an outboard motor that coughed and sputtered, piloted by a man who was standing in the stern with a pole in his hand. He was looking at them, his face expressionless, his eyes taking in their torn clothing, their bleeding faces, their wild eyes, and the terror that radiated from them like heat. "Help us," Sarah screamed, waving her arms. "Please help." The fisherman did not respond immediately. He watched them approach with the patience of a man who had seen too many things in the jungle to be surprised by anything, and for a moment Sarah thought he would turn his boat and leave them to the darkness behind. But then he nodded, a small gesture that might have been acceptance or resignation, and he used the pole to push the pirogue toward the bank. They reached the river's edge as the first spider broke through the trees behind them, a medium-sized hunter that leaped toward Sarah with a speed that was horrifying in its finality. She threw herself forward, her body landing half in the water and half on the muddy bank, and the spider's claws raked the air where she had been, burying themselves in the soft earth with a sound like knives thrust into wet clay. The fisherman struck the spider with his pole, a blow that connected with its cephalothorax and sent it tumbling backward into the undergrowth. It was not injured. The pole was wood, and the spider's armor was chitin, and the contest was unequal. But the surprise of the resistance was enough to make it pause to reassess. And in that pause, Sarah and Vance scrambled into the pirogue, and the fisherman gunned the motor, and the boat surged away from the bank with a roar that drowned out the clicking of pursuing legs. They did not stop until they had rounded a bend in the river, and the grove was hidden behind walls of vegetation that seemed to close in protectively, cutting off sight of the horror they had escaped. The fisherman did not ask questions. He piloted the boat with the silence of a man who understood that some experiences could not be shared with words, and when they reached a village 3 hours downstream, he helped them ashore and accepted the money that Sarah pressed into his hand, with a nod that suggested he would have preferred not to have seen what he had seen. The village was small, a collection of huts on stilts above the floodplain, and the people there were kind in the way of people who had learned not to ask too many questions about the jungle's casualties. They gave Sarah and Vance water and food and a hut to rest in, and they pretended not to notice the way the two outsiders flinched at every sound, the way they stared at the shadows as if expecting them to move, the way they held their weapons even while eating. Vance sat by the fire that night, his camera clutched in his hands, staring at the images he had captured, the curtains of silk, the diker in its web, the purple mark on the alpha's abdomen. His face was empty, the mask of the scientist cracked to reveal the child beneath, the child who had wanted to believe in wonders and had found only monsters. "I had it," he said, not to Sarah but to the fire. "I had the proof, the photographs, the data, everything I needed to rebuild my reputation, and I threw it away. I used the flare to save you instead of documenting the species. I chose survival over discovery." "You chose humanity over obsession," Sarah said. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Vance turned to her, and his eyes were wet with tears that he seemed unaware of shedding. "In Madagascar, I chose discovery over truth. I fabricated evidence because the real evidence wasn't dramatic enough. And now, when I finally find something real, something that doesn't need fabrication, I destroy the evidence to save one person, one guide, one witness." "I'm not a witness," Sarah said quietly. "I'm a survivor, and so are you. That's worth more than any photograph." Vance did not answer. He turned back to the fire, and Sarah let him sit in his silence, nursing her ankle and her exhaustion, and the strange, floating sensation that came with having escaped a death that had seemed inevitable. The village healer came to her as the fire was dying, an old woman with eyes that had seen too much and hands that were gentle despite their calluses. She examined Sarah's ankle, which had swollen to twice its normal size, and was discolored with bruising that spread up her calf like the fingers of a dark hand. The healer made clucking sounds and applied a poultice of herbs that smelled of mint and camphor, wrapping the ankle in cloth and instructing Sarah to keep it elevated. "You were lucky," the healer said in French, her voice raspy with age. "The big spiders do not often let their prey escape. You must have powerful spirits watching over you." "Not spirits," Sarah said, "just stubbornness." The healer smiled, a gesture that revealed teeth worn to nubs by decades of chewing fibrous plants. "Stubbornness is a spirit too, but you should know the spiders mark their prey. Even when they do not catch it, they mark it, so the colony will know if you return. They will know you were chosen." Sarah laughed, a bitter sound that had no humor in it. "I'm not going back, not ever." "No," the healer agreed, "but the mark does not care where you go. It only cares that you carry it." Sarah did not understand the words until the next morning, when she woke to the sound of birds singing and the warmth of sunlight on her face. The healer's poultice had reduced the swelling, and her ankle was sore but functional, and for a moment, in the peace of the village morning, she allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was over. Then she looked down at her ankle. The bruising had faded, replaced by a discoloration that was not purple in the way of tissue damage, but in the way of the mark on the alpha's abdomen. It was small, no larger than a mosquito bite, but it was unmistakable, a tiny puncture wound, almost invisible against her skin, surrounded by a halo of violet that seemed to glow in the morning light. And from it, radiating outward in fine lines that followed the paths of her veins, were threads of discoloration that were too regular to be natural, too patterned to be accidental. Sarah touched the mark with her fingers and felt nothing. No pain, no heat, no indication that the wound was anything more than a scratch. But when she looked closer, when she held her ankle to the light and examined it with the scrutiny of a woman who had learned to distrust the jungle's gentleness, she saw that the puncture was not empty. There was something inside it, something small and hard and alive, no bigger than a grain of rice, that pulsed with a rhythm that matched her own heartbeat. "Elias," she said, and her voice was calm, too calm, the calm of someone who had already accepted the inevitable. Vance came to her, his face still haggard from the night's vigil, and she showed him the mark. He stared at it for a long moment, his scientific mind cataloging the symptoms even as his human mind recoiled from the implications. The puncture, the discoloration, the radiating lines, the absence of pain. "The neurotoxin," he said, his voice hollow. "The fever that Smith described, it's not a fever, it's a venom. A slow-acting compound that induces paralysis and hallucinations that makes the prey docile and ripe for the colony. The spiders don't just preserve their victims, they prepare them, they season them." "How long?" Sarah asked. "I don't know. Smith's journals were unclear. Days maybe, weeks. The timeline depends on the dose, the victim's metabolism, the environment." "And the hallucinations?" Vance looked at her and she saw the answer in his eyes before he spoke. "They begin gradually. Disorientation, changes in perception. The victim begins to see the world differently, to find beauty in things that should inspire terror." Sarah smiled. It was a small smile, gentle and genuine, and it transformed her face into something that was almost beautiful. "The silence of the jungle," she said, her voice dreamy and distant. "Do you remember how quiet it was? I thought it was frightening at first, but now I think it was quite beautiful. The way the web held everything together, the way the colony moved as one. It was like a dance, Elias, a perfect, silent dance." Vance stepped back from her, his face contorted in an expression that was half grief, half horror. "Sarah," he whispered, "the venom, it's already working." "Is it?" She looked at him with eyes that were slightly glazed, that reflected the morning light in a way that seemed to hold more colors than they should have. "Or am I just finally seeing clearly? The J'ba Fofi isn't a monster, Elias. It's an artist. It weaves the world into patterns that we can't understand because we're too small, too brief, too limited by our human perspective. But I'm starting to understand. I can feel it in the mark." It's teaching me." She stood, her ankles supporting her weight without pain, and walked to the edge of the village where the jungle began. The trees were waiting there, their branches heavy with silk that was invisible from a distance but shimmered when she focused her eyes just so. The colony was waiting too, she knew, not with hunger but with welcome, with the patience of something that had already claimed her and was willing to wait for the ripening. "I'm not going to fight it," she said, and her voice was not sad but serene, the voice of a woman who had found peace in the most unexpected place. "I'm going to let it teach me. I'm going to let it show me the dance." Vance watched her stand at the edge of the jungle, her body silhouetted against the green wall of vegetation, and he understood with a clarity that broke his heart that he had not saved her. He had only delayed the inevitable. The J'ba Fofi did not lose its prey. It marked it, tracked it, waited for it to return. The purple mark on Sarah's ankle was not a wound. It was an invitation, a promise, a thread in the web that would eventually draw her back, not as a victim but as a participant, a node in the network that she now found beautiful. He thought of the photographs on his camera, the proof that he had sacrificed for her life, and he knew that they would never be enough. The scientific world would see them and dismiss them, as it had dismissed Smith's journals, as it had dismissed every account of the impossible that did not fit into the comfortable boxes of taxonomy and theory. The J'ba Fofi would remain a legend, a ghost, a story told by fishermen and grandmothers to children who would grow up to forget. But Sarah would remember. Sarah would know. And someday, when the venom had completed its work and her mind had been rewritten by the colony's chemical language, she would return to the grove. She would walk through the curtains of silk with a smile on her face, and she would lie down in the heart of the web, and she would let the alpha wrap her in the warm embrace of preservation, and she would hang among the others with her eyes open and her mind at peace, a witness to the beauty of the dance. Vance sat by the fire until the sun was high and the village was busy with the sounds of daily life, and then he stood and walked to the riverbank where the fishing boats were tied. He did not look back at the jungle. He did not look for Sarah, who had already vanished into the green shadows, following a call that only she could hear. He got in a boat and told the fishermen to take him downstream, to the city, to the world of concrete and light where the spiders were small, and the webs were fragile, and the silence was just an absence of sound, rather than a presence that could be woven into patterns of predation and preservation. He would go back to his apartment, to his empty rooms and his failed career, and he would try to forget the way the alpha's eyes had tracked him, the way the silk had felt beneath his fingers, the way Sarah's smile had transformed into something that was no longer human. But he would not forget. He would never forget. And sometimes, in the deep hours of the night when the city was quiet and the darkness pressed against his windows, he would hear a sound, not a song exactly, not a voice exactly, but a vibration, a hum, a rhythm that traveled through the earth and the air and the water, connecting every living thing in a web that was older than civilization and would outlast it by millennia. And in that sound, he would hear Sarah's voice, whispering that the silence was beautiful, that the dance was perfect, that the purple mark was not a wound but a gift. And he would lie awake until dawn, trembling, wondering if the mark was spreading in ways that could not be seen, if the venom was already in his own blood, if the colony had claimed him too in ways that he did not yet understand. The jungle swallowed Sarah Okonkwo on the morning of the 9th day, and she was never seen again by human eyes. But in the villages along the Lualaba, the fishermen sometimes spoke of a woman who walked among the trees at night, her body wrapped in shadows and her footsteps silent on the spongy ground. They said she smiled at the spiders, and that the spiders bowed to her, and that she had become something more than human and less than divine, a bridge between the world of men and the world of silk. And in the heart of the grove, in the chamber where the alpha slept and the young were born, there was a new cocoon, not large, not prominent, but placed with care in a position of honor near the center of the spiral. It was different from the others, wrapped not in gray silk but in threads that shimmered with a faint purple luminescence, and inside it, the hunters said, there was a woman who dreamed of silence and woke only to weave. The J'ba Fofi did not hunt alone. It hunted as a colony, as a network, as a single organism distributed across the grove. And now, in the body of Sarah Okonkwo, it had found a new node, a new voice, a new way of seeing the world through eyes that had once been human. The purple mark spread, not quickly, not visibly, but steadily, following the rivers and the roads and the paths that connected the villages of the Congo. In the months that followed, there were reports of strange behavior, fishermen who walked into the jungle and did not return, children who spoke of beautiful dances in the darkness, healers who found violet punctures on the ankles of their patients and could not explain them. The scientific world ignored these reports, as it had ignored Smith's journals, as it had ignored Vance's photographs. There was no evidence, no proof, no specimen that could be dissected and catalogued. Only stories, only legends, only the silence that spread like a stain across the basin, consuming the sounds of birds and monkeys and men, replacing them with the hum of a web that was growing larger with every passing day. And somewhere in the depths of the grove, suspended in her cocoon of purple silk, Sarah Okonkwo smiled with eyes that had learned to see in darkness, and she listened to the vibrations that traveled through the web carrying news of the world beyond the trees. She listened, and she waited, and she dreamed of the day when the colony would be large enough, strong enough, patient enough, to reach beyond the jungle and touch the cities where the skeptics lived, where the disbelievers worked, where the men who had dismissed her as a logistics expert would finally understand that she had become something far more important. She had become the thread that bound the world together, the purple mark that signaled the colony's expansion, the silence that was not an absence but a presence, a voice, a song that would eventually be heard by every living thing on Earth. And in the quiet moments between the vibrations, when the web was still and the hunters slept, she would whisper to herself in a voice that was no longer entirely her own. The silence is beautiful, the dance is perfect, and we are all finally home. The Gashadokuro of the Forgotten Valley. The first thing we noticed wasn't the sound, but the smell of wet calcium and old battlefields, drifting through the vents of our luxury mountain ryokan. Vincent Harada stood at the window of his suite on the inn's third floor, his breath fogging the glass as he stared out into the darkness of the valley below, and he felt the smell reach him through the climate-controlled air like a memory from a life he had never lived. It was the smell of bones left too long in damp earth, of calcium leaching into groundwater, of the particular mineral tang that clung to old ossuaries and abandoned graveyards. But beneath that familiar scent was something else, something older and more disturbing, the smell of violence preserved, of rage congealed, of hatred so concentrated that it had achieved a kind of physical presence, a miasma that drifted through the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for centuries. Vincent had smelled battlefields before. He had done his graduate research in places where human conflict had left permanent scars on the landscape: Verdun, Hiroshima, the killing fields of Cambodia. He understood that violence had a smell, a particular combination of chemicals and emotions that lingered in the soil long after the blood had been washed away. But this smell was different. It wasn't the smell of a remembered battle. It was the smell of a forgotten one, the smell of death that had never been properly acknowledged, never been ritually processed, never been given the closure that allowed the dead to rest and the living to move on. It was the smell of a massacre that had been erased from maps and erased from history and erased from the collective memory of a nation, but not from the land itself. The land remembered. The land always remembered. Behind him, the other members of the expedition were settling into their respective rooms, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the traditional Japanese inn, with a cheerful casualness that Vincent found almost obscene given their surroundings. They were urban explorers, mostly, young men and women who had made names for themselves on social media by infiltrating abandoned buildings, documenting decay, and transforming urban blight into aesthetic content for followers who would never smell the mold or feel the structural instability, or understand the genuine danger of trespassing in places that had been abandoned for good reason. They had invited Vincent along because he was a historian, because he had written a book about forgotten military sites in East Asia, because his academic credentials lent legitimacy to what would otherwise be dismissed as thrill-seeking tourism. And Vincent had accepted because he was running out of funding, because his tenure-track position had evaporated in a cloud of departmental politics, because the advance from the documentary company that was following their expedition would pay his rent for the next 6 months. There were 7 of them in total. Vincent, the historian, the reluctant academic who had traded intellectual integrity for financial survival. Marcus Webb, no relation to the financier of Egyptian legend, though Vincent sometimes wondered if the name was cursed. A tall, athletic man in his late 20s who ran the most popular urban exploration channel on YouTube, with 2 million subscribers who watched him scale skyscrapers and descend into sewers with a reckless bravado that Vincent found simultaneously impressive and disturbing. Leela Chen, Marcus's girlfriend and co-host, a photographer whose eye for composition had transformed decay into art and whose Instagram following numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Kevin Okonkwo, a tech specialist who handled drones and camera equipment, a quiet man whose jokes were rare but sharp when they came. Sarah Kim, a local fixer and translator who had arranged their permits and transportation, a woman whose knowledge of rural Japan's hidden places was matched only by her discretion about how she had acquired it. Tom Bradley, a freelance journalist who was writing a feature about the expedition for a major travel magazine. And Dr. Kenji Tanaka, a retired academic who had been Vincent's mentor during his graduate studies and who had been the one to suggest this particular destination, this particular valley, this particular piece of forgotten history. The village of Yamagihara, Tanaka had explained during the long train ride from Tokyo, his voice carrying the particular cadence of a man who had spent decades lecturing to rooms full of distracted students. It existed during the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, a small farming community in a remote valley, too insignificant to merit attention from the major daimyo. But in 1573, it found itself caught between 2 advancing armies, the forces of Oda Nobunaga and the remnants of the Imagawa clan. Neither side considered the village strategically important, but both needed to pass through the valley to reach their objectives. And in the chaos of their passage, something happened. Something terrible. What happened? Leela had asked, her camera already recording, always recording. No one knows for certain, Tanaka had said, his expression darkening. The records are fragmented, contradictory, deliberately obscured. What we do know is that the village was destroyed, not merely conquered or plundered, destroyed. Every building burned, every crop salted, every inhabitant killed, and afterward the land was declared kegir, spiritually defiled. The bodies were left where they fell, no funerals were performed, no prayers were offered, no memorials were erected. The village was erased from official maps, its name struck from the census records, its existence denied by the very authorities who had allowed its destruction. For 450 years, the valley of Yamagihara has been taboo, forbidden, forgotten. But we're going there, Marcus had said, grinning, because that's what we do. We go to the places that everyone else forgot. You go to the places that everyone else forgot, Tanaka had corrected gently, because you don't understand why they were forgotten, because you think that forgetting is an accident rather than a choice, because you believe that the past is inert, harmless, waiting to be discovered like buried treasure. But the past is not inert, Mr. Webb. The past is alive, and in places like Yamagihara, it is hungry. Marcus had laughed, dismissing the old man's warning as dramatic embellishment designed to make the documentary more compelling. Vincent had not laughed. He had seen the look in Tanaka's eyes, a look of genuine fear, genuine respect, genuine knowledge of something that transcended academic curiosity. Tanaka had been to Yamagihara before. That much was clear, and whatever he had seen there had marked him in ways that he had never fully explained. Now, standing at the window of the ryokan, breathing in the smell of wet calcium and old battlefields, Vincent understood that Tanaka's warnings had not been embellishment. They had been inadequate. The reality of this place exceeded any warning that could be conveyed in words. It was a presence, a pressure, a weight that settled on the chest and made the air feel thick and the darkness feel active. The ryokan itself was an anomaly. It was a luxury establishment, newly built, catering to wealthy tourists who wanted to experience traditional Japan without sacrificing modern comforts. It sat on the edge of the valley, its back facing the slope that led down into Yamagihara, its front offering stunning views of a landscape that had been carefully manicured to appear untouched by history. The local staff were impeccably polite, bowing and smiling with the mechanical precision of people who had been trained in hospitality rather than raised in it. But Vincent had noticed something in their eyes, a watchfulness, a wariness, a barely concealed anxiety that suggested they knew something about this valley that they weren't sharing with their guests. "They keep insisting we stay inside after midnight," Sarah had mentioned at dinner, her chopsticks pausing over a plate of exquisite seasonal cuisine. "3 different staff members have told me, in exactly the same words, that the mountain air becomes unhealthy after 12. It's like they're reading from a script." "Local superstition," Marcus had said, waving his hand dismissively. "Every remote area has its ghost stories. It keeps the tourists in line and adds a little mystique to the experience." "It's not superstition," Tanaka had said quietly. "It's protection. The staff know what lives in that valley. They've seen it, or their grandparents have seen it, or their grandparents' grandparents. And they've learned that the only way to survive is to respect the boundaries, to stay inside, to avoid the windows, to pretend that the valley doesn't exist." "And what exactly lives in the valley, Dr. Tanaka?" Tom had asked, his journalist's instincts sensing a story. "Ghosts, demons, giant skeletons." "The Gashadokuro," Tanaka had said, and the word had fallen into the conversation like a stone into still water, sending ripples of unease through the group. "The starving skeleton, the hungry ghost, a yakai formed from the accumulated bones of those who died without proper burial, without proper mourning, without the rituals that allow the soul to depart. When the dead are forgotten, when their suffering is denied, their resentment coalesces into something terrible, something that grows with every year of neglect, every decade of silence, every century of denial. The Gashadokuro does not haunt for pleasure. It haunts for hunger. It is the physical manifestation of a collective grudge, the rage of the unmourned given form and purpose and an insatiable appetite for the living." "Cool," Marcus had said, though his voice lacked conviction. "That's going to make great content." "It will make your death," Tanaka had replied, his voice flat and unemotional. "If you do not respect the warnings, if you do not stay inside after midnight, if you do not avoid the valley and its contents. The Gashadokuro is not a story. It is not folklore. It is a natural law, as real and as implacable as gravity. And it is particularly active in places like Yamagihara, where the dead have been accumulating their grievances for 4.5 centuries. The conversation had shifted after that, moving to safer topics: equipment logistics, shooting schedules, the challenges of filming in low-light conditions. But Vincent had noticed that the others were quieter than usual, that their jokes seemed forced, that their eyes kept drifting toward the windows and the darkness beyond. Tanaka's warning had planted a seed of unease that would not be easily dismissed. Vincent turned from the window now and walked to his futon, which had been laid out on the tatami floor by the ryokan's efficient staff. The room was beautiful in the way that traditional Japanese spaces were beautiful, minimalist, serene, carefully composed to create a sense of peace and contemplation. But the smell of wet calcium persisted, seeping through the vents and the gaps in the wooden framework, a reminder that the valley's darkness was not kept out by walls or windows or the polite fictions of luxury hospitality. He lay down, pulling the thick comforter up to his chin, and tried to sleep. The day's travel had been exhausting. The train from Tokyo, the bus through mountain passes that seemed to grow narrower and more precipitous with each turn, the final hike up to the ryokan with their equipment weighing heavily on their backs. His body craved rest, but his mind was active, spinning through historical records and mythological accounts, trying to construct a framework that would allow him to understand what Tanaka had described. The Gashadokuro, the starving skeleton. In the folklore, it was typically described as a giant formed from the bones of those who died of starvation or were left unburied, its bones clicking together with a sound like gach-gach as it moved through the night, searching for human prey. It was said to be invisible until it struck, blending into the darkness and the moonlight, its massive form detectable only by the sudden shadow it cast or the preternatural silence that preceded its attack. It grabbed victims with hands the size of human torsos, crushing them or biting off their heads, and it was driven by an endless hunger that could never be satisfied because it was not a physical appetite but a spiritual one. The hunger of the forgotten to be remembered, the hunger of the unmourned to be mourned, the hunger of the dead to drag the living into their oblivion. But Vincent knew that folklore was never just folklore. Myths encoded real dangers, real traumas, real warnings that had been passed down through generations in symbolic language that bypassed rational understanding and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the brain. The Gashadokuro was not a monster. It was a metaphor for the consequences of social neglect, for the violence that accumulated when communities failed to process their traumas, for the way that unacknowledged suffering eventually erupted into destructive force. The question was whether the metaphor could sometimes become literal, whether the accumulated weight of human pain could achieve the kind of mass that allowed it to manifest in physical form. Vincent didn't believe in literal monsters. He believed in history, in sociology, in the ways that human behavior created conditions that seemed supernatural to those who didn't understand their origins. But lying in the darkness of the ryokan, breathing in the smell of wet calcium and old battlefields, he found his rationalism wavering. There was something in this valley, something that the locals feared with a depth that went far beyond superstition, something that the ryokan's careful wards, the ancient Shinto ropes and salt lines that Vincent had noticed surrounding the building, were designed to keep at bay. The Shimnawa ropes. He had noticed them during their approach, the thick, braided straw ropes draped around the ryokan's perimeter, hung with white paper streamers that fluttered in the mountain breeze. He had assumed they were decorative, part of the traditional aesthetic that the luxury establishment cultivated for its guests. But now, remembering the staff's insistence that guests stay inside after midnight, remembering Tanaka's warnings about the valley's contents, Vincent understood that the ropes were functional. They were wards, barriers, spiritual fortifications designed to delineate a safe space in a landscape that had been spiritually compromised for centuries. And the salt lines. He had seen them too, though he hadn't recognized them for what they were at the time. Thin lines of white powder arranged in patterns around the building's foundation, barely visible against the pale stone, easy to dismiss as weathering or mineral deposits. But salt was a traditional purifying agent in Shinto practice, used to cleanse spaces of malevolent influences, to create boundaries that spirits could not cross. The ryokan's builders had not been creating a luxury retreat. They had been building a fortress, a redoubt in hostile territory, a place of safety surrounded by a landscape of danger. Vincent sat up, his heart beating faster, his mind racing through implications. If the ryokan was fortified, it was fortified against something specific, something that the locals believed was real enough to warrant genuine protective measures. And if those protective measures included ancient Shinto rituals as well as modern construction techniques, then whatever they were protecting against was not merely historical trauma or social dysfunction. It was something that existed in the same ontological category as the rituals themselves, something spiritual, something supernatural, something that responded to the symbolic language of purification and boundary. He was still sitting up, still wrestling with these thoughts, when he heard the sound. It was faint at first, so faint that he thought it might be his imagination, the auditory equivalent of the smell that had been drifting through the vents. A rhythmic clicking, like bones knocking together, like teeth chattering in cold, like the gacha-gacha sound that Tanaka had described. It came from the valley, from the darkness beyond the ryokan's carefully maintained gardens, and it was accompanied by a sensation that Vincent couldn't quite name, a vibration in the air, a pressure against his eardrums, a sense that something massive was moving in the darkness, something whose footsteps were too large to hear individually, but whose cumulative impact created a subsonic rumble that resonated in his chest. He rose from his futon and moved back to the window, his bare feet silent on the tatami, his hand trembling as he pushed aside the curtain to look out into the night. The valley was visible in the moonlight, a bowl of darkness surrounded by the jagged silhouettes of mountain peaks, and for a moment Vincent saw nothing but the ordinary beauty of a rural Japanese night. The moon hanging low and bright, the stars scattered across the sky in familiar constellations, the mist rising from the valley floor in thin tendrils that caught the silver light. But then the mist moved, not with the random diffusion of natural fog, but with purpose, with direction, with the terrible intentionality of something alive. It swirled and condensed, gathering itself into a column that rose from the valley floor like a waterspout forming over a tropical sea. And within that column, Vincent saw movement, not the smooth flow of vapor, but the jerky, staccato motion of individual components, of pieces fitting together, of structure emerging from chaos. Bones, hundreds of bones, thousands of bones, rising from the valley floor in a swirling vortex of calcium and phosphorus, and the accumulated rage of 4.5 centuries of neglect. They were bleached white in the moonlight, and they moved with a sound like hail on a tin roof, like 1,000 wind chimes in a hurricane, like the gacha-gacha of folklore made real and terrible and immediate. They swirled and clicked and locked together, forming shapes that suggested a skeleton, but on a scale that dwarfed anything human, anything natural, anything that had ever walked the earth in flesh and blood. Vincent's breath caught in his throat. His hand, still gripping the curtain, began to tremble violently. He wanted to scream, to warn the others, to bang on walls and shout until everyone in the ryokan was awake and aware and fleeing for their lives. But his voice wouldn't work. His body wouldn't move. He was frozen, pinned by the sight of the impossible thing that was assembling itself in the valley below, the thing that should not exist but did, the thing that the ryokan's wards were straining to keep at bay, the thing that the ancient Shinto ropes and salt lines were holding back by the thinnest of margins. The Gashadokuro, the starving skeleton, the hungry ghost made flesh, or made bone rather, since flesh was exactly what it lacked and exactly what it craved. It was forming, coalescing, growing larger with each passing second as more bones were drawn from the valley floor, from the mass grave that had been accumulating for centuries, from the fused heap that some explorer had disturbed. And Vincent realized then, with a sinking horror that made his stomach clench, that someone must have disturbed the bones. Someone must have violated the taboo. Someone must have provided the catalyst that allowed the Gashadokuro to manifest. And he knew with terrible certainty exactly who that someone was. Marcus Webb, the urban explorer, the content creator, the man who couldn't resist touching what shouldn't be touched, documenting what shouldn't be documented, claiming what shouldn't be claimed. Marcus had gone into the valley during the afternoon, while the others had been settling into their rooms. Vincent had seen him returning, had noticed something bulky in his backpack, had assumed it was camera equipment or a drone or some other piece of tech. But now, watching the Gashadokuro assemble itself from the violated remains of Yamagihara, Vincent understood that Marcus had taken something. Something from the bone mound. Something that the Gashadokuro wanted back. The creature completed its formation, the last bones clicking into place with a sound like a thunderclap, and it stood in the valley, a towering skeletal titan, easily 50 feet tall, its ribs like the columns of a cathedral, its skull like a small house, its finger bones like fence posts, its eye sockets pits of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. It was terrifying in its silence. No roar, no snarl, no battle cry, just the terrible, patient stillness of something that had been waiting for centuries and could wait a few moments more. And then it moved. One massive skeletal foot rising from the valley floor, bones clicking and grinding, and descending with an impact that Vincent felt through the ryokan's foundation, through the tatami beneath his feet, through the marrow of his own bones. Another step, and another. The Gashadokuro was climbing the slope toward the ryokan, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette operated by a drunken puppeteer, but inexorable, unstoppable, driven by a hunger that transcended physical need and spoke directly to the primal fear of being consumed. Vincent finally found his voice, though it emerged as a cracked whisper rather than a shout. "Marcus! Oh God, Marcus, what did you do?" The Gashadokuro reached the ryokan's perimeter, and Vincent saw the Shimnawa ropes begin to glow with a faint, blue-white light. The wards were activating, the spiritual defenses engaging, and for a moment Vincent dared to hope that they would hold, that the ancient magic would be sufficient to repel the monster that approached. But the Gashadokuro didn't slow. It didn't hesitate. It simply reached out with one massive skeletal hand and grasped the nearest Shimnawa, its finger bones closing around the braided straw with a sound like dry branches snapping and pulled. The rope came away in its grasp, the white paper streamers fluttering to the ground like dying moths, and Vincent felt something shift in the atmosphere of the ryokan. A pressure released, a boundary breached, the protective circle broken by the creature's impossible strength and the ancient rage that fueled it. The Gashadokuro stepped across the salt lines, its massive feet crushing the purifying powder into the earth, and Vincent understood with absolute clarity that the nightmare was no longer approaching. It was here. The starving skeleton had arrived, and the feast was about to begin. "Wake up!" Vincent finally managed to scream, his voice breaking through the paralysis that had held him. "Everyone wake up, it's here. The Gashadokuro is here." His voice echoed through the ryokan, and he heard movements from the other rooms, confused shouts, running footsteps, the crash of someone falling out of bed. But he didn't take his eyes from the window, from the impossible thing that was now standing in the ryokan's garden, its massive skull turning slowly from side to side as if searching for something, its empty eye sockets scanning the building with an attention that Vincent could feel pressing against his skin like a physical force. It was looking for what had been taken. It was looking for the piece of itself that Marcus had removed from the valley. And when it found Marcus, the consequences would be beyond anything Vincent's rational mind could comprehend. The gacha-gacha sound resumed, louder now, closer, and Vincent felt the vibration in his teeth and behind his eyes. The Gashadokuro was ready. The forgotten dead had risen, and the luxury mountain ryokan, with its climate control and its traditional aesthetics and its carefully cultivated sense of peace, was about to become a slaughterhouse. Vincent backed away from the window, his heart hammering, his breath coming in short gasps, and he reached for the door of his room, his hand fumbling for the handle in the darkness. He had to find the others. He had to find Tanaka. He had to find Marcus and the thing he had stolen and return it to the valley before the Gashadokuro tore the ryokan apart stone by stone. But even as he reached for the door, he heard the first crash from below, the sound of a massive skeletal hand punching through the roof of the first floor, the screams of staff members who had been caught in the sudden violence, the wet thud of something heavy and soft hitting the ground. The Gashadokuro wasn't waiting. The Gashadokuro wasn't negotiating. The Gashadokuro was hunting. And Vincent Harada, historian, academic, rationalist, was about to learn that some histories were too terrible to be studied from a distance. Some histories demanded participation. Some histories demanded blood. He flung open the door and ran into the corridor, into the chaos, into the nightmare that had finally arrived from the Valley of the Forgotten Dead. The corridor of the Ryokan's third floor was a nightmare of shadows and confusion. Vincent ran through darkness that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, his bare feet slipping on the polished wooden floors, his hands groping along walls that trembled with each impact from below. The Gashadokuro was striking the building with methodical precision, its massive skeletal fists punching through ceilings and walls, not in a frenzy of destruction, but in a calculated search, as if it knew that the thing it sought was hidden somewhere within, and was determined to find it no matter how many layers of wood and plaster stood in its way. Vincent collided with someone in the darkness, a soft body, a startled scream, the familiar scent of Leela's lavender shampoo. "Leela," he gasped, grabbing her shoulders to steady them both. "Where's Marcus? We need to find Marcus right now." "Marcus?" Leela's voice was high and broken, near hysterical. I don't know. I woke up and the building was shaking and I heard screaming and Vincent, what's happening? What's out there?" "The Gashadokuro. The thing Tanaka warned us about. It's real, Leela. It's here. And Marcus took something from the valley, something that belongs to it, and we need to find him and get it back before this whole place comes down around us." Leela stared at him, her face pale in the dim emergency lighting that had flickered on somewhere down the corridor, and Vincent saw the moment when denial cracked and acceptance flooded in. "The skull," she whispered. "He showed me. He said it would be the perfect centerpiece for his collection. He said no one would ever know." "Where is it? Where did he put it?" "His bag in our room. Second floor, room 204. Another crash shook the building, closer this time, and Vincent felt the floor tilt beneath his feet as structural support somewhere below gave way. The Gashadokuro was ascending, working its way upward through the Ryokan's interior, its massive form too large for the stairwells but somehow fitting through spaces that should have been impossible, as if the bones could compress and reconfigure themselves to squeeze through gaps that defied its apparent bulk. "Go to the lobby," Vincent shouted, pushing Leela toward the stairwell. "Find Tanaka, find anyone else who's still alive, and stay away from the windows, stay away from the walls. The creature can reach through solid structure." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to find Marcus and get that skull back." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and ran toward the stairwell, taking the steps 2 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that made his vision pulse red at the edges. The second floor was worse than the third. Here, the Gashadokuro's assault had already breached the exterior walls, and moonlight poured through jagged openings where the creature's fists had punched through plaster and timber. Vincent could see the garden below, could see the massive skeletal legs standing amid the ruins of the Ryokan's traditional landscaping, could see the bones of the creature's feet grinding against the earth with a sound like millstones crushing grain. Room 204. The door was open, swinging on broken hinges, and inside Vincent found chaos. Marcus's equipment was scattered across the floor, cameras, lenses, climbing gear, the tools of his urban exploration trade, and in the center of the devastation sat his backpack, its main compartment bulging with something that radiated a cold that Vincent could feel from across the room. He didn't want to touch it. Every instinct screamed at him to leave it alone, to run, to join the others in whatever futile attempt at survival they were making in the lobby below. But he knew, with a certainty that transcended fear, that the skull was the key. The Gashadokuro wasn't attacking randomly. It was hunting for its missing piece. And if he could return that piece, if he could restore what had been stolen, the creature might be sated. He reached for the backpack, his fingers trembling, and the moment he touched the fabric he felt it. A vibration, cold and rhythmic, emanating from within. It wasn't the gachi-gachi of the Gashadokuro's movement. It was something else, something older and more intimate. The residual consciousness of the person whose skull had been taken, the lingering awareness of someone who had died in agony 4.5 centuries ago, and whose remains were now being used as a decorative object by a thoughtless content creator. Vincent unzipped the compartment and looked inside. The skull was small, human, weathered to the color of old parchment by centuries of exposure. It was not dramatically different from any other ancient skull except for one detail. The jaw was fused open in an expression of silent screaming, the teeth ground down to nubs as if the person had spent their final hours biting at something that could not be bitten. And the eye sockets were not empty. They contained a faint luminescence, a phosphorescence that pulsed in rhythm with the vibration Vincent felt through his fingers, suggesting that whatever had once looked out from those sockets was still somehow present, still somehow aware, still somehow suffering. He wrapped the skull in a spare shirt from Marcus's scattered luggage, not from any sense of reverence, but because he couldn't bear to touch the bare bone with his bare skin, and he shoved the bundle into his own jacket. The skull was cold against his chest, a frozen weight that seemed to pull heat from his body, and he could feel the vibration intensifying, as if the skull recognized that it was being moved, that the journey back to its resting place was beginning. Another crash, this one so close that Vincent felt splinters of wood pepper his back like shrapnel. He turned to see the Gashadokuro's hand punching through the wall of room 204, skeletal fingers spreading wide as they grasped for him, for the skull, for the warmth of living flesh that the creature craved with an intensity that transcended mere predation. Vincent dove sideways, rolling across the tatami and coming up in a crouch, and the hand withdrew, only to be replaced by the creature's face, its massive skull pressing against the hole in the wall, its empty eye sockets somehow fixing on Vincent's position despite the absence of anything that could be called eyes. It knew. Somehow, impossibly, the Gashadokuro knew that he had the skull. Vincent could feel its attention pressing against his mind like a physical weight, a hunger that was not merely for flesh, but for completion, for wholeness, for the restoration of what had been taken from the collective mass of bones that formed its being. And he understood in that moment of terrible communion that the creature was not merely angry, it was incomplete. The stolen skull was a wound in its substance, a missing piece that caused it pain, that drove its rage, that fueled its endless hunger for the living. Vincent ran. He burst from room 204 into the corridor, which was now partially open to the night sky, the Gashadokuro's assault having transformed the ryokan's second floor into a ruin of broken timber and exposed rebar. He could see the stairwell ahead, could see the way down to the first floor and the lobby where the others might be waiting, but the creature's hand crashed through the floor behind him, skeletal fingers closing around empty air inches from his ankle. He vaulted over the shattered railing of the stairwell, dropping the last 6 feet to the first floor landing, and felt his ankle twist as he landed, pain shooting up his leg in a bright flash that made him gasp. He limped toward the lobby, the skull heavy against his chest, the Gashadokuro's presence pressing against his back like a physical force. The first floor was devastation. The creature's initial assault had targeted the ryokan's structural supports, collapsing walls and ceilings into heaps of rubble that Vincent had to navigate in near-total darkness, his path illuminated only by the moonlight that poured through the holes in the upper floors and the occasional spark from damaged electrical systems. He found the others in what remained of the lobby. Tanaka was there, his aged face pale but composed, his hands clasped in front of him in a gesture that suggested prayer or meditation, or simply the calm acceptance of a man who had known this moment was coming. Leela was huddled in a corner, her camera forgotten, her body shaking with sobs that produced no tears. Kevin Okonkwo stood near the shattered entrance, his drone controller in one hand and a fire extinguisher in the other, his expression suggesting he had already considered and rejected a dozen different escape plans. Tom Bradley was nowhere to be seen, and Vincent felt a cold certainty about what had happened to the journalist. The Gashadokuro's first strike, the wet thud he had heard from his third-floor window, the remains that were probably scattered across what had once been the Ryokan's carefully maintained Zen garden. "Where's Marcus?" Vincent demanded, his voice rough from dust and screaming. "He ran," Sarah said. She was crouched behind the reception desk, her translator's credentials useless in a situation that required no translation. "When the creature first attacked, he ran out the back toward the valley. He thought he could get to the van, drive away." "The van's gone," Kevin said quietly. "I saw it from the window. The creature stepped on it." Vincent closed his eyes, a wave of despair threatening to overwhelm him. Marcus had stolen the skull. Marcus had caused this, and Marcus had died trying to escape the consequences of his theft, leaving Vincent to deal with the aftermath. The skull pressed cold against his chest, a frozen weight that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the Gashadokuro's movements, and Vincent understood with terrible clarity that the creature would not stop. It would tear the Ryokan apart piece by piece, would hunt them through the rubble and the darkness, would continue its assault until the skull was returned, or until every living thing in the valley had been consumed. "The skull," Tanaka said, his voice cutting through Vincent's despair like a knife. "You have it." Vincent pulled the bundle from his jacket, unwrapping the shirt to reveal the weathered skull with its pulsing luminescence. Tanaka's eyes widened, and for a moment Vincent saw something that might have been awe or might have been terror cross the old man's face. "So it's true," Tanaka whispered. "The bones are aware. The dead are still conscious. 450 years and they still know what was done to them." "What do we do?" Vincent asked. "How do we stop this?" "We don't stop it," Tanaka said. "We appease it, we satisfy the grudge. The Gashadokuro is not a mindless beast, Vincent. It is the accumulated rage of thousands of souls who were denied proper mourning. It wants to be acknowledged. It wants to be remembered. It wants the living to feel what they felt, the starvation, the abandonment, the despair of being forgotten." "So we give it the skull back," Leela said, her voice rising. "We throw it out the window and hope that's enough." "Throwing is not enough," Tanaka said. "Returning is not enough. The act of theft created a wound. The wound must be healed through ritual, through recognition, through genuine, profound mourning. The Gashadokuro doesn't want the skull returned as an object. It wants the skull returned as a person. It wants us to mourn the death that the skull represents, to acknowledge the suffering, to take upon ourselves, even for a moment, the weight of what was done to the people of Yamagihara." "Then let's do it," Vincent said. "Whatever ritual you know, whatever prayer needs to be said, let's do it now, before that thing brings the whole building down." Tanaka shook his head, his expression sorrowful. "It's not that simple. The ritual requires sincerity. It requires that the mourner genuinely feel the grief, genuinely carry the weight of the loss. And he paused, his shoulders slumping. "I have been to this valley before. I have seen what the Gashadokuro does. And I have spent 40 years trying to forget it, trying to deny it, trying to pretend that what I witnessed was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and fear. My guilt, my cowardice, my refusal to acknowledge what I saw, these things have made me heavy, too heavy to perform the ritual. The Gashadokuro would sense my insincerity. It would know that my mourning was performative rather than genuine, and it would reject the offering." "Then who," Vincent demanded, "who among us is light enough? Who among us is pure enough?" Tanaka looked at him, and Vincent saw something in the old man's eyes that made his stomach sink. "You, Vincent. You came to this place not for content or glory or excitement. You came because you understand history as something alive, something that demands respect. You have spent your career studying the dead, not as objects but as people. You have felt their pain through the documents and the artifacts. You have carried their weight in ways that the others have not. I'm not a priest, Vincent protested. I'm not a Shinto practitioner. I don't know the words, I don't know the gestures. The words don't matter, Tanaka said urgently. The gestures don't matter. What matters is the intention, the genuine, heartfelt recognition of suffering, the willingness to feel for a moment what the forgotten dead felt, the willingness to carry their weight. The building shook again, and a section of the lobby ceiling collapsed, showering them with dust and debris. Through the hole, Vincent could see the Gashadokuro skull looming against the night sky, its jaw opening and closing in that silent, terrible rhythm, its eye sockets scanning the interior of the ryokan with an attention that was almost surgical in its precision. It's searching, Kevin said, his voice flat. It's searching for the skull. Then let's give it what it wants, Vincent said, his decision made in the space between heartbeats. Tell me what to do, tell me what to say, and I'll do my best to mean it. Tanaka grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the center of the lobby, away from the walls, away from the windows, to a space that was relatively clear of debris. Kneel, he instructed. Hold the skull in both hands, look at it. See the person, not the bone. See the life that was lived, the death that was suffered, the centuries of neglect that followed. Vincent knelt, the cold floor pressing against his knees, the skull cradled in his palms. It was lighter than he expected, dry and fragile, the calcium porous and crumbling at the edges. But the luminescence in the eye sockets was brighter now, pulsing in a rhythm that matched his own heartbeat, and Vincent felt something shift in his perception, as if the skull was reaching out to him, connecting with him, drawing him into a communion that transcended the barriers between living and dead. What was his name? Vincent asked, his voice barely audible. We don't know, Tanaka said. The records were destroyed, the names were erased. That is part of the tragedy. Then I'll give him one, Vincent said. I'll call him Taro, Taro of Yamagihara, a farmer perhaps, a father perhaps, a man who woke up on the morning of his death not knowing that it would be his last, who tended his fields and kissed his children and went to his rest in the evening, only to be woken by the sound of armies and fire and screaming. A man who died in terror and pain and was left to rot where he fell, his bones becoming part of the mound, his memory becoming part of the silence. He spoke the words aloud, and as he did, he felt something change in the atmosphere of the lobby. The pressure that had been building, the sense of imminent destruction, seemed to pause, to hold its breath, to wait and see what would happen next. The Gashadokuro's assault stopped. The building ceased its shaking, and in the sudden, terrible silence, Vincent felt the weight of 4.5 centuries of neglect pressing down upon him. I mourn you, Taro, Vincent whispered. I mourn what was done to you. I mourn the life that was stolen. I mourn the peace that was denied. I mourn the memory that was erased. And I take upon myself for this moment the weight of your suffering. I acknowledge it, I feel it, I carry it. The skull's luminescence intensified, pulsing faster, brighter, and Vincent felt a coldness spreading through his hands, up his arms, into his chest. It was not the cold of the grave exactly. It was the cold of absence, of emptiness, of the void that existed where a person should have been. He felt Taro's death, felt the sword or the spear or the flame, felt the terror and the pain and the desperate, futile struggle to survive. He felt the abandonment, the moment when consciousness faded and the body was left to the elements, to the scavengers, to the slow process of decay that would eventually reduce him to the skull that Vincent now held. And he felt what came after, the decades of silence, the centuries of forgetting, the gradual transformation of individual tragedy into collective absence, of personal grievance into communal guilt. He felt the weight of all the other deaths, all the other unmourned souls, all the other forgotten bones that had fused together to form the Gashadokuro. He felt their hunger. He felt their rage. He felt their desperate, insatiable need to be acknowledged, to be remembered, to be mourned. The weight was crushing. It pressed against his chest like a stone, squeezed his lungs until he could barely breathe, drove the air from his body in gasps that were almost sobs. He wanted to drop the skull, to release the burden, to return to the safety of his rational, academic, emotionally protected existence. But he didn't. He held on. He carried the weight, because that was what mourning meant. That was what acknowledgement required. That was the price of appeasing a grudge that had been accumulating for 4.5 centuries. "I see you," Vincent gasped, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with the effort of carrying what he had never been meant to carry. "I see all of you, the farmers and the craftsmen and the mothers and the children. I see your deaths. I see your abandonment. I see the injustice that was done to you. And I am sorry. I am so sorry. Not because I caused it, not because I could have prevented it, but because it happened, because you suffered, because you were forgotten, and because that forgetting was wrong." The skull's luminescence reached a peak, blinding in its intensity, and Vincent felt something release. Not from the skull, but from himself. A knot of tension, a block of resistance, a lifetime of emotional distance from the suffering of others. He had spent his career studying death from a safe remove, analyzing statistics and documents and artifacts, never allowing himself to feel the reality of what he described. But now, holding Taro's skull in his hands, feeling the weight of centuries of unmourned death pressing against his chest, he understood that distance was not protection. It was merely postponement. Sooner or later, the weight had to be carried. Sooner or later, the mourning had to be felt. And in that understanding, in that surrender to grief, Vincent felt something else as well. The Gashadokuro's hunger. The creature was not merely angry. It was starving, not for flesh but for recognition, not for destruction but for justice. It had been formed from the grudge of the forgotten, and its existence was defined by the absence of what had been denied to its components, the rituals, the prayers, the communal acknowledgement that allowed the dead to rest. Without those things, the bones could not settle. Without those things, the rage could not dissipate. Without those things, the hunger would continue forever. "I give you this," Vincent whispered, his voice breaking. "Not as a gift, not as a sacrifice, but as a recognition, a witness. A testimony that you existed, that you suffered, that you mattered. Taro of Yamajihara, I see you. I remember you. I mourn you." The skull's light began to dim, pulsing slower, softer, and Vincent felt the coldness in his chest begin to recede, replaced by a warmth that was almost comforting. The weight didn't disappear entirely. It never would. But it shifted, transformed from crushing pressure to something that could be carried, something that could be borne, something that could be integrated into the ongoing project of living rather than destroying it. He looked up, expecting to see the Gashadokuro still looming above the ruined ryokan, still hungry, still hunting. But the creature was motionless. Its massive skull was tilted to one side in an almost canine gesture of curiosity, its jaw hanging open, its empty eye sockets fixed on Vincent with an attention that was no longer hostile but was instead evaluating, considering, weighing. The gachai-gachai sound had stopped. The clicking of bones that had accompanied the creature's every movement had fallen silent, and in that silence, Vincent felt something that he hadn't expected to feel in the presence of a monster: hope. "It's working," Tanaka breathed, his voice hushed with awe. "The mourning is being accepted. The grudge is being acknowledged." But the hope was premature. The Gashadokuro might have paused its assault, might have been momentarily satisfied by Vincent's genuine grief, but the creature was not finished. It had been starving for 4.5 centuries, and a single moment of recognition, however sincere, could not fully sate that hunger. The creature's jaw closed with a snap that echoed across the valley, and it reached down with one massive skeletal hand, not toward Vincent, but toward the cliff face that bordered the ryokan's property. Vincent watched in horror as the creature's fingers closed around a section of the cliff, its bones grinding against the rock with a sound like teeth on a dentist's drill. And then, with terrible, effortless strength, the Gashadokuro pulled. The cliff face shuddered. Cracks appeared in the stone, spiderwebbing outward from the creature's grip. And then, with a sound like the world ending, a massive section of the cliff broke away, tumbling down toward the ryokan in a cascade of rock and dust and ancient earth. "Run!" Tanaka screamed, but there was nowhere to run. The landslide was too large, too fast, too comprehensive. It swept across the ryokan's grounds, burying the garden, burying the remains of the first floor, burying everything in its path under tons of stone and soil and debris. Vincent scrambled backward, still clutching the skull, his body driven by pure animal terror as the wall of rock and dust rushed toward him. He saw Kevin Okonkwo swept away, the tech specialist's scream cut off by the crushing weight of the avalanche. He saw Sarah Kim pinned against the reception desk by a boulder the size of a car, her body crushed in an instant. He saw Lila Chen running for the shattered entrance, her movements too slow, her path blocked by the cascading debris. And then the world went dark. Not the darkness of night, but the absolute darkness of burial, of suffocation, of being trapped beneath tons of earth with no hope of rescue. Vincent felt himself lifted, tossed, slammed against something hard, and then the weight came down, pressing against his chest, his legs, his face, sealing him in a coffin of rock and dirt and the pulverized remains of the ryokan. He couldn't breathe. The air was thick with dust, unbreathable, and the weight pressing against his chest was too much, too heavy, too absolute. He was going to die here, buried alive in the Valley of the Forgotten, his body joining the mass grave that had existed for centuries, his bones becoming part of the Gashadokuro's substance, his consciousness adding to the collective grudge that fueled the creature's endless hunger. But the skull was still in his hands. Even in the darkness, even beneath the crushing weight, he could feel its presence, its luminescence, its connection to the creature that waited above. And he understood with a clarity that transcended panic that the Gashadokuro's attack had not been a rejection of his mourning. It had been a test. The creature had needed to know if his grief was genuine enough to withstand destruction, if his acknowledgement was deep enough to survive annihilation. And now, buried in the dark, carrying the weight of Taro's skull and the weight of the mountain itself, Vincent had to prove that it was. He held the skull against his chest, pressing it to his heart, and he began to pray. Not a Shinto prayer, he didn't know the words. Not a Christian prayer, he had abandoned that faith decades ago. Not a Buddhist prayer, he had never learned the sutras. He prayed in the only language he knew, the language of history, of memory, of human connection across the gulf of time and death. "I am here," he whispered into the darkness, into the dust, into the crushing weight that pressed against his face. "I am here with you. I am not leaving. I am not forgetting. I am here." The skull pulsed once, twice, 3 times. And then, impossibly, Vincent felt the weight shift. Not lifting exactly, but redistributing, creating a small pocket of space around his chest and face, enough to draw a breath, enough to survive, enough to endure. Above him, in the world of the living, the Gashadokuro waited. The creature had not moved since the landslide, its massive form standing motionless amid the ruins, its skull tilted toward the buried ryokan as if listening for something. And in the silence that followed the destruction, in the pause between the violence and whatever came next, Vincent understood that the battle was not over. It had merely changed form. The creature was testing him, probing him, waiting to see if his mourning was a momentary performance or a genuine transformation. He would have to endure. He would have to survive. He would have to carry the weight of the skull and the weight of the mountain and the weight of 4.5 centuries of forgotten death until the Gashadokuro was satisfied or until his own body failed. There was no other option. There was no escape. There was only the darkness and the dust and the cold skull pressed against his chest and the distant, rhythmic sound of bones clicking together in the silence. Gacha gacha, gacha gacha, gacha gacha. The sound of the starving skeleton. The sound of the forgotten dead, the sound that would accompany Vincent through the longest night of his life, and perhaps through the longest night of his death. The darkness was absolute, not the darkness of a room with closed curtains, not the darkness of a moonless night in the countryside, but the profound, crushing darkness of being buried alive, of earth and stone pressing against every surface of the body, of air that was thick with dust and the smell of pulverized mortality. Vincent lay in his pocket of space, the skull clutched against his chest with a grip that had long since gone numb, and he felt the weight of the mountain above him as a physical presence that was almost sentient, almost curious, as if the earth itself was examining him to determine whether he was worthy of release or deserving of permanent entombment. Time had ceased to function in any meaningful way. Vincent had no way of knowing whether minutes or hours had passed since the landslide. His phone was in his pocket, crushed or inaccessible, and the luminescence of the skull provided the only illumination in his narrow coffin of stone and soil. The light was dimmer now, pulsing slowly, weakly, like a heartbeat that was gradually slowing toward its final cessation. And with each pulse, Vincent felt something else diminishing as well. The connection he had established with the skull, the communion he had achieved through his desperate mourning, the fragile bridge between the living and the dead that had been his only protection against the Gashadokuro's endless hunger. He was dying. He knew this with a clarity that transcended denial. The air in his pocket was growing stale, the oxygen depleted by his panicked breathing, replaced by carbon dioxide and the mineral exhalations of crushed stone. His chest ached with each inhalation, a sharp pain that suggested ribs damaged by the impact, perhaps puncturing something vital inside. His legs were numb, pinned beneath debris that he couldn't see and couldn't shift, the circulation cut off to the point where he could no longer feel his feet. And the cold was spreading, radiating outward from the skull and from the earth itself, seeping into his bones with a persistence that suggested hypothermia rather than mere discomfort. But he didn't let go of the skull. He couldn't. It was the only thing that stood between him and the absolute void, the only anchor in a reality that had dissolved into darkness and dust and the distant, rhythmic clicking of bones. The gacha-gacha sound continued above him, muffled by the tons of earth that separated him from the surface, but still audible, still present, still patient. The Gashadokuro was waiting. The creature had not abandoned the site of its destruction. It was standing vigil over the buried ryokan, listening for signs of life, listening for the continuation of the mourning that Vincent had begun, listening for any indication that the living still remembered the dead. Vincent understood the creature's nature now in ways that transcended academic analysis. He had felt the hunger directly, had carried the weight of the grudge in his own chest, had experienced the desperate, insatiable need for recognition that drove the Gashadokuro's every action. It wasn't evil, not in any moral sense. It was wounded. It was the accumulated trauma of 4.5 centuries of neglect, given form and purpose and an endless appetite for the one thing that could never be fully consumed, the acknowledgement of suffering. The more the living tried to ignore it, the stronger it grew. The more they tried to forget it, the more it demanded to be remembered. And the only way to satisfy it, even temporarily, was to offer genuine, profound, heartfelt mourning, to feel the weight of the dead and to carry it willingly. But Vincent's mourning was fading. The initial surge of grief that had carried him through the ritual was dissipating, worn down by pain and exhaustion and the gradual asphyxiation of his air supply. He was beginning to feel resentment, anger, the desperate, selfish desire to survive that was the natural response of any living creature facing death. And he knew, with a certainty that made his stomach clench, that the Gashadokuro could sense this shift. The creature was attuned to the emotional states of the living, could read the weight of their hearts as easily as Vincent could read a history book. And if his heart grew heavy with resentment rather than light with grief, the creature would reject him. The protection would fail, and the crushing weight above him would become his permanent tomb. "I'm trying," Vincent whispered into the darkness, his voice barely audible even to himself. "I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to mourn, but I'm so tired, I'm so cold, and I don't want to die." The skull pulsed once in response, a brief flare of luminescence that was almost sympathetic, And in that pulse Vincent felt something that he hadn't expected. Not judgment, not condemnation, but understanding. The skull, or whatever consciousness remained within it, understood his fear. It had felt the same fear, 4.5 centuries ago, in the final moments of its life. The terror of death, the desperate clinging to existence, the refusal to accept oblivion. These were universal experiences, binding the living and the dead in a communion of mortality that transcended time and culture and the particular circumstances of individual lives. "You were afraid too," Vincent whispered, his tears mixing with the dust on his face to create a paste that cracked when he moved his jaw. "Taro, you didn't want to die, you didn't want to be forgotten. And you weren't. I'm here, I remember. Even if I die here, even if I never leave this hole, I remember, I see you. I mourn you." The skull's luminescence brightened, and Vincent felt something shift in the atmosphere of his burial chamber. Not the physical weight, that remained constant, crushing, absolute, but something else. The psychic pressure. The sense of being evaluated, judged, weighed on some scale that he couldn't see but could feel in the deepest parts of his being. The Gashadokuro was still testing him, still waiting, still determining whether his mourning was sufficient to warrant his survival. And then from above, through the tons of earth and stone, Vincent heard something that made his blood run cold. Not the gachi-gachi of the creature's movement, not the grinding of stone against stone, but voices, human voices, the voices of the other survivors, if there were any, calling out from the surface, searching for him, searching for anyone who might still be alive beneath the rubble. "Vincent," it was Tanaka's voice, distant and muffled but unmistakable. "Vincent, can you hear me? Are you down there?" Vincent wanted to shout back. He wanted to scream, to pound on the debris above him, to signal his location with every ounce of strength he had left. But he didn't, because he understood with a sudden terrible clarity that shouting would be a mistake. The Gashadokuro was still there. The creature was still listening, and if it heard living voices, if it sensed living presence, its hunger would reawaken. The momentary peace that Vincent's mourning had achieved would be shattered, and the destruction would resume. He lay still, his heart hammering, his breath held, his body frozen in the posture of the dead. Above him, Tanaka's voice continued to call, growing fainter as the old man moved away, searching other areas of the rubble. And Vincent felt tears streaming down his face again, not from fear but from the terrible grief of hearing a human voice and being unable to respond, of being separated from the world of the living by a barrier that was both physical and spiritual, both earth and the judgment of a creature that he had never fully believed existed until it had buried him alive. The voices faded, the silence returned, and Vincent was alone again, with the skull and the darkness and the crushing weight and the distant, patient gachi-gachi of the Gashadokuro's vigil. He didn't know how long he lay there. Time had become fluid, meaningless, a river that flowed in circles rather than lines. He drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening greeted by the same darkness, the same weight, the same slow pulsing of the skull's luminescence. He hallucinated, saw his mother's face in the dust, saw his graduate advisor shaking his head in disappointment, saw the streets of Tokyo burning in the firebombings of 1945, saw things that had happened before his birth and things that might happen after his death. The skull's influence, he realized dimly, was expanding, reaching into his mind, sharing its memories, its traumas, its centuries of accumulated silence. And then, without warning, the world shifted. It began as a vibration, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the skull itself rather than from any external source. The luminescence intensified, pulsing rapidly, erratically, and Vincent felt something pressing against his consciousness. Not an attack, not an invasion, but a communication. The skull was showing him something, sharing something. A vision that transcended words and images, a direct transmission of meaning that bypassed his rational mind and spoke to the primitive, instinctive part of his brain that understood danger and safety, predator and prey, life and death. He saw the Gashadokuro from above, from outside, from a perspective that suggested he was floating somewhere above the buried ryokan, looking down at the scene with the detached clarity of a spirit or a dreamer. The creature was still standing in the ruins, its massive form motionless, its skull tilted toward the earth where Vincent lay buried. But something was changing. The creature's bones were shifting, realigning, losing their coherence. The massive skeletal form was becoming unstable, its constituent parts beginning to separate, to drift apart, to lose the collective unity that had allowed them to function as a single entity. The Gashadokuro was collapsing, not from external attack, not from the wards or the prayers or any conventional means of exorcism. It was collapsing from within, from the weight of its own accumulated grudge, from the burden of centuries of unmourned suffering that had finally become too heavy to sustain. Vincent's mourning had been the catalyst. His genuine, heartfelt acknowledgement of the dead had provided a momentary satisfaction, a brief respite from the endless hunger, and in that respite, the creature had lost some of the rage that held it together. Without the rage, without the grudge, without the desperate, insatiable need for recognition, the Gashadokuro had no purpose, and without purpose, the bones had no reason to remain united. The vision shifted, and Vincent saw the creature's final moments. The massive skull tilting backward, the jaw falling open in a silent scream that was not anger but relief, the eye sockets dimming as the luminescence that animated them faded. The ribs separating like the petals of a dying flower, spreading outward and then tumbling downward, each bone returning to the earth from which it had been drawn. The arms collapsing, the legs buckling, the entire massive form disintegrating in a cascade of calcium and phosphorus, and the final, exhausted exhalation of 4.5 centuries of rage. The sound was immense. Not a roar, not an explosion, but the sound of a mountain of porcelain shattering, of a million china dishes breaking simultaneously, of the accumulated fragility of centuries finally succumbing to gravity and entropy. The Gashadokuro fell, and its fall was the fall of Yamagihara's collective grievance, the collapse of a grudge that had outlived every human who had contributed to it, the dissolution of a hunger that could never have been fully sated but had been, for a moment, briefly, imperfectly, acknowledged. And then the vision ended and Vincent was back in his darkness, back in his crushing weight, back in his slow suffocation beneath tons of earth. But something was different. The skull in his hands was cold now, genuinely cold, the luminescence extinguished, the vibration silenced. Terror was gone. The consciousness that had lingered in the bone for 4.5 centuries had finally departed, released by Vincent's mourning, freed by the collapse of the Gashadokuro, returned to whatever peace awaited the forgotten dead when they were finally remembered. Vincent was alone, truly alone, with the dead skull and the dead earth and the dying air and the silence that was no longer expectant but merely empty. He should have died there, he knew that. The mathematics of his situation were unforgiving. Limited air supply, damaged body, tons of debris, remote location, no rescue imminent. The odds of survival were effectively zero. And yet, as he lay in the darkness, holding the skull that was now nothing more than bone, he felt something shift in the weight above him. Not a removal of the weight, that would have required heavy machinery and hours of careful excavation, but a redistribution, a settling, a collapse of the debris that had, by pure chance or by some final intervention of the forces that governed this valley, created a small tunnel, a narrow passage, a way out. Vincent felt air moving against his face, not the stale, dust-thick air of his burial chamber, but fresher air, cooler air, air that smelled of pine and mountain and the approaching dawn. He turned his head, ignoring the stab of pain from his damaged ribs, and saw it, a pinprick of gray light, faint but unmistakable, filtering through a gap in the debris above him. Daylight. Morning. The end of the longest night. He began to move. It was agony. Every shift of his body sent fresh waves of pain radiating from his ribs, his legs, his spine. The numbness in his lower extremities had begun to transition to pins and needles, suggesting that circulation was returning, but the returning sensation was almost worse than the numbness had been. He dragged himself through the narrow gap, the skull still clutched in one hand, his free hand clawing at the debris, pulling himself upward inch by inch toward the light. The tunnel was tight, barely wide enough for his shoulders, and the debris shifted alarmingly as he moved, threatening to collapse and bury him more thoroughly than before. But Vincent didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The light was above him, the air was fresher with each foot of progress, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice was screaming that this was impossible, that he should be dead, that no one survived being buried alive under tons of rock, that the tunnel must be a hallucination, a dying dream, the final fantasy of a brain starved of oxygen. But the light grew brighter, the air grew cleaner, and after what felt like hours but might have been only minutes, Vincent's hand broke through the surface of the debris, his fingers scrabbling against open air, against the cold morning wind, against the reality of survival that seemed almost as impossible as the monster that had buried him. He dragged himself out of the rubble, collapsing onto the ground beside the landslide, his body a symphony of pain and exhaustion and disbelief. The valley was silent. The Gashadokuro was gone. Its massive form collapsed into a heap of ordinary bones that covered the ryokan's grounds in a drift of calcium that looked almost like snow in the gray morning light. The creature's skull lay nearby, separated from its body, its jaw hanging open in that same expression of silent screaming that Vincent had first seen in Marcus's backpack. But the luminescence was gone. The awareness was gone. The hunger was gone. It was just bone now. Just calcium and phosphorus and the empty architecture of a life that had ended centuries ago. Vincent lay on his back, staring up at the sky, watching the gray of dawn gradually give way to the pale blue of morning. He was alive. He shouldn't have been, but he was. And the valley of Yamajihara was silent once more, its grudge temporarily satisfied, its monster temporarily dispersed, its dead temporarily at peace. He didn't know how long he lay there. Eventually, he became aware of movement nearby, of voices calling his name, of hands lifting him, of the familiar sound of helicopter rotors beating the air. Rescue had come, delayed but not denied, drawn by the satellite emergency beacon that Kevin Okonkwo had somehow activated before his death, or by Tanaka's eventual success in reaching a working phone. Vincent was lifted onto a stretcher, wrapped in thermal blankets, loaded into the helicopter alongside other survivors, Tanaka, pale and shaken but alive. Leela, catatonic with shock, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that only she could see. A few staff members who had been in the ryokan's reinforced basement when the attack came. He didn't see Marcus Webb's body. He didn't see Kevin Okonkwo's remains. He didn't see Sarah Kim's crushed form or Tom Bradley's scattered parts. The rescue team had found only the living, and the dead had been left where they fell, where they were buried, where they became part of the valley's ongoing accumulation of unmourned death. The helicopter lifted off, carrying Vincent away from the valley, away from the bones, away from the place where he had learned that monsters were real, and that morning was the only weapon that could defeat them. He watched through the window as the valley receded, as the heap of the Gashadokuro's remains grew smaller and smaller, as the mountains closed around the site of Yamajihara like jaws swallowing a secret. And he held the skull, Taro's skull, against his chest, refusing to let the rescue team take it from him, insisting that it was his, that he had earned it, that it was the price of his survival and the proof of his mourning. They didn't argue. They were too busy dealing with the other survivors, too busy managing the shock and the injuries and the impossibility of what they had found. A luxury ryokan destroyed by a landslide, they would report. Multiple casualties due to structural collapse. A few survivors pulled from the rubble by Chinese letter luck. The official story would be simple, plausible, easily accepted by a world that preferred natural disasters to supernatural ones. Vincent spent 3 weeks in a Tokyo hospital, his broken ribs knitted, his hypothermia treated, his psychological trauma managed by therapists who assumed he was suffering from standard post-traumatic stress. He didn't tell them about the Gashadokuro. He didn't tell them about the skull, which he kept hidden in his hospital room, wrapped in a towel and stored in the drawer beside his bed. He didn't tell them about the communion he had experienced with the dead, about the weight of the grudge he had carried, about the collapse of the monster that had buried him alive. He told them nothing, because he knew, with a certainty that transcended reason, that the story would not be believed, and because he knew, with an equal certainty, that telling the story would somehow reawaken what had been temporarily laid to rest. When he was released from the hospital, Vincent did not return to academia. He could not. The world of lectures and conferences and peer-reviewed publications seemed impossibly distant, impossibly trivial, impossibly disconnected from the reality he had experienced in the valley. He sold his apartment, cashed out his savings, and bought a small flat in the outskirts of Tokyo, in a concrete building that was indistinguishable from 1,000 other concrete buildings, in a neighborhood where no one asked questions and no one offered answers. He kept the skull. It sat on a shelf in his small apartment, wrapped in silk now rather than a spare shirt, positioned where he could see it from his bed, from his desk, from the single window that looked out onto an alleyway where stray cats hunted rats in the perpetual dusk of the city's shadowed spaces. It was just bone now, just calcium and phosphorus. The luminescence had never returned. The vibration had never resumed. Taro was gone, truly gone, released by Vincent's mourning and the collapse of the Gashadokuro into whatever peace awaited the forgotten dead. But Vincent still talked to it. Every evening, when the sun went down and the city's neon lights began to flicker on, he sat before the skull and he spoke. He told it about his day, about the mundane details of his diminished existence, about the weather and the traffic and the price of rice at the local convenience store. He told it about his dreams, which were still haunted by clicking bones and crushing weight and the terrible, patient silence of the Gashadokuro's vigil. He told it about his guilt, about the survivor's guilt that plagued him, about the irrational conviction that he should have died in the valley, that his survival was a mistake, that the universe had miscounted and would eventually correct its error. And sometimes in the quiet hours of the night, when the city's noise had faded to a background hum and the alleyway outside his window was empty of even the stray cats, Vincent heard something. Not from the skull. The skull was silent, would always be silent now, but from somewhere else, somewhere below, somewhere in the city's foundations, in its sewers, in its underground spaces where the forgotten things accumulated. It was the gacha-gacha sound, the clicking of bones, the rhythmic metallic clattering that had announced the Gashadokuro's approach in the valley of Yamajihara. It was faint, distant, almost below the threshold of hearing, but Vincent recognized it instantly. He would always recognize it. It was the sound that had accompanied the longest night of his life, the sound that had paced his burial, the sound that had finally faded with the dawn and the creature's collapse. And now it was here, in the city, in the sewers beneath his feet, in the darkness that lurked beneath the bright lights and the bustling crowds and the illusion of safety that modern civilization projected. Vincent stood at his window, looking down at the alleyway, listening to the faint, rhythmic clicking that drifted up from the drains and the manhole covers and the subterranean spaces where the city's waste collected and fermented and transformed. He knew what it meant. He knew what it signified. The Gashadokuro of Yamajihara had collapsed, its grudge temporarily satisfied, its bones returned to the earth. But the Gashadokuro was not unique. It was not singular. It was a type, a category, a manifestation of a universal phenomenon that occurred wherever the dead were forgotten and the living refused to mourn. Tokyo was full of forgotten dead. Every city was. The victims of war and disaster and disease and violence, buried in mass graves and cremated in anonymity and scattered to the winds without proper ceremony, without proper prayer, without the acknowledgement that allowed souls to rest. Their bones were everywhere, mixed with the concrete and the steel and the asphalt of modern construction, compressed into the foundations of skyscrapers and train stations and apartment buildings. Their grudges accumulated silently, invisibly, waiting for the catalyst that would allow them to coalesce into something hungry and vast and terrible. The gacha-gacha sound continued, rhythmic and patient, and Vincent understood that somewhere in the sewers below, something was forming. Something was assembling itself from the forgotten bones of the city's unmourned dead, drawing calcium from the water supply, drawing phosphorus from the waste, drawing rage from the accumulated grievances of souls who had died without acknowledgement, and who were still waiting, still hungry, still desperate for the recognition that would allow them to rest. It would be small at first, a fragment, a whisper, a few bones clicking together in the darkness, but it would grow. It always grew. Given time and neglect and the refusal of the living to acknowledge their dead, the Gashadokuro would achieve the mass that allowed it to manifest, the size that allowed it to hunt, the hunger that allowed it to consume. Vincent pressed his hand against the glass of his window, feeling the cold against his palm, feeling the vibration of the city's endless motion, feeling the faint, rhythmic clicking that rose from below like a heartbeat or a warning or a prayer. He thought of Taro's skull on its shelf, silent now, at peace now, its purpose fulfilled. He thought of the skulls that were not at peace, the bones that were not silent, the dead who were still waiting in the darkness for someone to remember them. He could run. He could leave the city, leave the country, leave the hemisphere. He could go somewhere remote and isolated, somewhere without the accumulated weight of centuries of unmourned death. But he knew, with the certainty of a man who had faced the impossible and survived, that there was no escape. The Gashadokuro was not a local phenomenon. It was not limited to Japanese valleys or Asian battlefields. It was everywhere. It was the shadow that followed every civilization, the consequence of every war, the price of every massacre that was forgotten rather than forgiven. And the only way to keep it at bay, the only way to prevent it from growing, from manifesting, from consuming, was to remember, to mourn, to acknowledge, to carry the weight of the dead with the same willingness that Vincent had carried Taro's grudge in the darkness of his burial. He turned from the window and walked to the shelf where the skull sat wrapped in silk. He unwrapped it, held it in his hands, looked into the empty eye sockets that had once contained luminescence, and now contained only the peace of the released. "I remember," Vincent whispered. "I see you, I mourn you, and I will not forget." The skull was silent. The skull would always be silent now. But in the silence, Vincent felt something that might have been acceptance, might have been gratitude, might have been the ghost of a consciousness that had finally found its rest. Below in the sewers, the gacha-gacha sound continued, patient, persistent, eternal, the sound of the forgotten dead, waiting for their turn to be remembered, waiting for their turn to be mourned, waiting for their turn to be released from the hunger that consumed them. Vincent sat with the skull in his lap, and he began to speak, not to Taro this time, but to all of them, to the unnamed dead of Tokyo's sewers, to the forgotten victims of every war and every disaster and every cruelty that human beings had ever inflicted upon one another. He spoke their names, the names he didn't know, the names that had been erased, the names that existed only in the collective memory of the bones themselves. He acknowledged their suffering. He carried their weight, and he hoped with a hope that was almost as heavy as the grief that his mourning would be enough. The gacha-gacha sound faded, not disappeared but faded, retreated, postponed. The hunger beneath the city was not satisfied, but it was momentarily appeased, momentarily acknowledged, momentarily recognized as real and present and deserving of the one thing that could never be fully given but must be endlessly offered, the honest, heartfelt, genuine mourning of the living for the dead. Vincent sat in his small apartment, in his concrete building, in his anonymous neighborhood, and he held the skull and he spoke into the darkness. And in the sewers below, the bones clicked softly, waiting, always waiting, for the next forgetting, the next neglect, the next moment when the living would turn away and the dead would rise again to demand what was theirs. The Gashadokuro of Yamagihara had fallen, but the Gashadokuro was not gone. It was merely sleeping. And in cities around the world, in valleys and battlefields and mass graves and forgotten corners, the bones were waiting, always waiting, for the moment when the weight of neglect would become too heavy to bear and the starving skeleton would rise again. Vincent pressed the skull against his chest, feeling its coldness, feeling its peace, feeling its silence. And he understood with a depth that would define the rest of his life that the horror was not in the monster. The horror was in the forgetting, and the only defense against the horror was the endless, exhausting, absolutely necessary work of remembering. He would remember, he would mourn, he would carry the weight, for Taro, for Yamagihara, for all the forgotten dead whose names he would never know but whose suffering he would never deny. And in the darkness, in the silence, in the spaces between the living and the dead, the gachai-gachai sound continued, patient, persistent, eternal, the heartbeat of the unmourned, the rhythm of the forgotten, the song of the starving skeleton that could never be fully sated, but could be for a moment acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement find the only peace that was available to the dead, the peace of being seen. Vincent closed his eyes, he held the skull, and he waited for the dawn. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed, please leave a like and subscribe, so you don't miss the stories yet to come.